Fort Hood, Texas Veterans Reunion 2019. The banquet hall hummed with conversation as old soldiers gathered in small clusters, their dress uniforms adorned with ribbons and medals that told stories without words. At the center of the room stood retired Colonel James "Iron Jim" Blackwood, his weathered face a roadmap of 72 years of life. Despite the slight stoop to his shoulders and the silver of his hair, his eyes remained as sharp and penetrating as they had been in his prime. "Colonel Blackwood will be speaking in 5 minutes," announced the MC, his voice carrying over the chatter. Jim nodded in acknowledgement, taking a moment to straighten his tie as he prepared to address the crowd. The younger veterans, men in their 30s and 40s, who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, regarded him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. To them, he was almost a mythical figure, a tank commander from another era whose exploits were taught at West Point. The room quieted as Jim took his position at the podium, surveying the faces before him. He cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward the microphone. "They teach you in the Army that there are wars in the history books, and then there are the wars that never make it to the pages," he began, his voice gravelly but strong. "Today, I want to tell you about a battle that the American people never knew happened. A battle on American soil that was classified at the highest levels and remains so to this day." The audience leaned forward collectively, drawn in by the conspiratorial tone of his voice. Jim could see the skepticism on some faces, particularly a young captain seated near the front who wore the armor insignia on his uniform. "With all due respect, sir," the captain called out, unable to contain himself, "are we talking about a training exercise? Because I'm pretty sure a real battle on U.S. soil would have made the news." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jim smiled, not offended by the challenge. He had expected it. "Son, I understand your skepticism," he replied, reaching into his pocket. "The government has ways of keeping things quiet when necessary." He pulled out a small metal fragment, blackened and twisted by extreme heat. The audience fell silent as Jim held it up for all to see. "This is a piece of a Soviet T-72 tank that tried to kill me in 1986. Not in Germany, not in some proxy war overseas, but right here in Texas, less than 30 miles from the Mexican border." The skeptical captain's eyes widened, and the room erupted in surprised murmurs. "What I'm about to tell you never officially happened. The reports were sealed, the witnesses sworn to secrecy, and the dead quietly honored without public recognition. But it did happen, and it's time the story was told." Fort Bliss, Texas, April 12, 1986. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as Captain James Blackwood stepped out of the administration building, orders in hand. At 39, Jim was older than most captains, his career advancement slowed by his reputation as a maverick. The desert air was still cool, but Jim knew from experience that by noon, the temperature would be merciless. He squinted against the sunlight, taking in the sprawling military base that would be his home for the foreseeable future. In the distance, he could see the silhouettes of tanks on the training grounds, their long gun barrels reaching toward the sky. The sight of them stirred something in his chest, a familiar sense of purpose that had guided him through 2 tours in Vietnam. Unlike many officers who had pursued desk jobs after Vietnam, Jim had remained in armor, drawn to the raw power and decisive impact of tank warfare. His superiors recognized his talent, but were often frustrated by his unorthodox approaches to tactical problems. Jim believed in aggressive action, in seizing the initiative. This philosophy had saved lives in Vietnam, but had also earned him reprimands from commanders who preferred caution and standard procedures. The door to the administration building opened behind him, and Colonel Frank Harrison emerged. Harrison was a legend in the armor community, a World War II veteran who had commanded tanks during the breakout from Normandy. Now in his late 60s, he had delayed retirement to oversee the integration of the new M1 Abrams tanks into the force. "Blackwood," Harrison called, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "Walk with me." Jim fell into step beside the older officer, matching his pace. Harrison had personally requested Jim's transfer to Fort Bliss, overriding objections from officers who considered Jim too unpredictable for sensitive assignments. "I've read your file," Harrison said as they walked toward the motor pool. 3 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and more reprimands than most officers get in a lifetime." Jim remained silent, sensing there was more to come. "Your evaluations are interesting reading. Your commanding officers call you reckless, insubordinate, and excessively independent. Harrison paused, a hint of amusement crossing his weathered face. But they also say you're the man they'd want leading their tanks if the Soviets ever came through the Fulda Gap. I take that as a compliment, sir, Jim replied. Harrison stopped, turning to face Jim directly. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Harrison looked around to ensure no one was within earshot. We have a situation developing at the border. The drug cartels have acquired military hardware, serious hardware, that goes well beyond the small arms and trucks we're used to seeing. Jim frowned. How serious are we talking? T-72 tanks. The words hung in the air between them. Jim felt his blood run cold. The T-72 was the Soviet Union's main battle tank, a formidable adversary for any Western armored force. That's impossible, Jim said reflexively. How would Mexican drug cartels get Soviet main battle tanks? The same way they get everything else, Harrison replied grimly. Money, a lot of money. We've identified at least 5 T-72s that were sold through a complex network of international arms dealers. The CIA believes they originated from Libya or possibly Syria, but the details are murky. Jim's mind was racing through the implications. T-72s were designed to engage NATO forces in Europe, not patrol dusty Mexican backroads. Their presence on the border represented an unprecedented escalation. There's more, Harrison continued. These aren't just tanks sitting in a warehouse. They're operational, and they're crewed by professionals. We have intelligence suggesting the cartel has hired ex-Soviet tank crews, veterans of the Afghanistan conflict, to operate them. Jesus Christ, Jim muttered. What's the plan? Harrison's expression hardened. That's where you come in, Captain. I'm assembling a special task force of M1 Abrams tanks to counter this threat. You're going to be commanding one of those tanks, and I need you to select and train your crew immediately. The M1s just arrived last month, Jim observed. Most of the crews are still learning the basics. Which is why I need someone with your experience, Harrison countered. Someone who can think outside the box and make the most of the Abrams capabilities. They resumed walking, passing groups of soldiers engaged in morning PT. The normality of the scene stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary conversation taking place. You should know, Harrison added, that this operation is being run on a strict need-to-know basis. The State Department is terrified of creating an international incident, and Washington is worried about public panic if Americans find out there are Soviet tanks operating near the border. So we're keeping this quiet, Jim concluded. Officially, you're conducting extended training exercises, nothing more. Harrison handed Jim a folder. These are the technical specifications of both the M1 Abrams and the T-72. Study them carefully. Know your tank and know your enemies. Jim opened the folder, scanning the detailed diagrams and performance statistics of both vehicles. The M1 Abrams represented the cutting edge of American tank technology, featuring a gas turbine engine that could propel its 60-ton weight to speeds of 45 miles per hour, a revolutionary achievement in tank mobility. Its composite Chabam armor, a closely guarded secret, offered unprecedented protection against shape-charged warheads and kinetic penetrators. The main armament, a 105mm rifled gun, was capable of firing a variety of ammunition types with extreme accuracy, even while moving across rough terrain. But what truly set the Abrams apart was its sophisticated fire control system, thermal imaging, and laser rangefinder, allowing for accurate first-round hits at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. In contrast, the Soviet T-72 followed a different design philosophy. At 45 tons, it was significantly lighter than the Abrams, with a lower profile that made it a smaller target on the battlefield. Its 125mm smoothbore gun was larger than the Abrams' 105mm, potentially giving it greater penetrating power. The T-72's autoloader system reduced the crew to 3 men, compared to the Abrams' 4, but created a dangerous ammunition storage situation that could result in catastrophic explosions if the tank was penetrated. While the T-72 lacked the sophisticated fire control systems of the Abrams, it was rugged, reliable, and designed for mass production. In the hands of experienced crews, it remained a deadly opponent. One last thing, Harrison said as Jim closed the folder. You'll be coordinating with Lieutenant Colonel William Parker. He's the official commander of this operation on paper. Jim couldn't hide his surprise. Parker, from Pentagon Planning? Harrison nodded, his expression revealing his own reservations. He has the right clearances and connections. But between us, he spent more time behind a desk than in a tank. That's why I need you on this, Blackwood. Parker may be in charge officially, but I'm counting on you to make the tactical decisions when it matters. Understood, sir, Jim replied, already anticipating the friction this arrangement would create. Your first mission is to select your crew, Harrison said. I've prepared a list of available personnel, but the final decision is yours. Choose wisely, Captain. The lives of your men and the success of this mission depend on it. Jim spent the rest of the day reviewing personnel files, searching for the right combination of skills and temperament for his crew. By evening, he had made his selections and summoned them to a secluded corner of the motor pool where a gleaming M1 Abrams waited, its desert camouflage paint still factory fresh. Sergeant Mike Donovan arrived first, precisely on time. At 32, Donovan was a veteran gunner who had served in the disastrous Operation Eagle Claw, the failed attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran. The experience had left him with a permanent distrust of rushed operations and a commitment to meticulous preparation. His marksmanship scores were consistently at the top of the charts, and he had already completed the transition training for the Abrams Advanced Fire Control System. Captain Blackwood, Donovan said, offering a crisp salute. Good to see you again, sir. Jim returned the salute. He and Donovan had crossed paths during training exercises in Germany several years earlier. Good to have you, Sergeant. Your eyes are the ones I want behind our gun sight. Next to arrive was Sergeant First Class Carlos Mendez, a stocky man with the powerful arms of a loader. At 28, Mendez had grown up in the tough neighborhoods of Chicago before finding his purpose in the Army. His personnel file noted his exceptional physical strength and endurance, crucial attributes for a loader who would be handling 50-pound shells in the confined space of a tank turret. Sergeant Mendez, Jim greeted him. How's your back feeling these days? Mendez grinned, revealing a gold tooth. Strong as ever, Captain, ready to feed the beast whatever she needs. The last to arrive was the youngest, Private First Class Billy Thompson, a lanky 19-year-old from rural Texas who had graduated at the top of his driver training class. Despite his youth, Thompson had displayed natural talent for handling the Abrams' unconventional gas turbine engine and complex transmission system. Sir, Thompson said nervously, his Adam's apple bobbing as he saluted. Reporting as ordered. Jim noted the anxiety in the young soldier's eyes. This would be Thompson's first real mission, a baptism by fire that would test his training and courage. At ease, Private, Jim said, gesturing toward the tank. That's our new home, the M1 Abrams, the most advanced tank in the world, and you're going to be the one driving it. Thompson's eyes widened as he took in the massive vehicle. Yes, sir, I won't let you down. Jim gathered the men closer. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest level. You are not to discuss it with anyone outside this crew, not even other soldiers in this task force. Is that clear? All three men nodded, their expressions serious. We're not conducting training exercises, Jim continued. We're preparing for a real combat mission against real enemy tanks on American soil. A drug cartel operating near the border has acquired Soviet T-72 tanks and hired experienced crews to operate them. He paused, allowing the information to sink in. Donovan's expression remained neutral, his years of experience having taught him to absorb shocking news without visible reaction. Mendez cursed softly in Spanish, while Thompson's face drained of color. Soviet tanks? Here? The young driver asked, his voice cracking slightly. That's correct, Private, Jim confirmed, which is why we need to master this tank and its capabilities immediately. Our lives will depend on it. He opened the folder Harrison had given him, spreading the technical diagrams of the T-72 across the hood of a nearby Jeep. The T-72 is a formidable opponent, Jim explained, pointing to various features of the Soviet tank. Its 125mm gun can penetrate conventional armor at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Its frontal armor is angled at 68 degrees, making it highly effective against kinetic penetrators. Donovan leaned forward, studying the diagrams with professional interest. What about weak points? Jim nodded approvingly at the question. The driver's hatch and the area around the gun mantlet are relatively vulnerable. But the biggest weakness is here, he said, indicating the carousel autoloader in the center of the tank. The T-72 stores its ammunition in a ring around the turret base. If a round penetrates and ignites that ammunition, the entire turret can be blown off. Jesus, Mendez whispered. Our advantage, Jim continued, turning to the Abrams diagrams, is this fire control system. We can hit targets with the first round at ranges the T-72 can only dream of. Our thermal sights allow us to see through dust, smoke, and darkness. And our armor, especially at the front, can withstand hits that would destroy any other tank in the world. He looked at each man in turn, making eye contact to emphasize his next point. But our greatest advantage is crew coordination. The Soviets rely on their equipment. We rely on each other. A tank is only as good as the men inside it. In the days that followed, Jim drove his crew relentlessly. They spent hours in the Abrams, mastering every system and practicing emergency procedures until they could perform them blindfolded. They ran drills for rapid target acquisition, misfire procedures, and damage control. When they weren't in the tank, they were studying intelligence reports on cartel movements and the suspected locations of the T-72s. Lieutenant Colonel Parker made his presence known a week into their training, arriving at the motor pool in a spotless uniform with a clipboard in hand. He was a tall, thin man with meticulously groomed hair and the soft hands of someone who had spent most of his career behind a desk. "Captain Blackwood?" Parker called out as Jim emerged from the tank, his uniform stained with grease. "I'd like a word." Jim wiped his hands on a rag and approached the officer. "Yes, sir?" Parker glanced at his clipboard. "I've been reviewing your training regimen. It seems excessively focused on combat operations rather than reconnaissance and observation, which are our primary objectives." "With respect, sir," Jim replied, choosing his words carefully, "if we encounter those T-72s, reconnaissance won't be enough. We need to be prepared to engage and destroy them." Parker's expression soared. "That decision is mine to make, Captain. Our rules of engagement are clear. Observe and report. We engage only if directly threatened and unable to withdraw." Jim felt his frustration rising but kept his voice level. "The T-72's main gun outranges most of our anti-tank weapons. By the time we're directly threatened, it might be too late to withdraw." "I've studied the technical specifications," Parker said dismissively. "Our M1s have superior fire control and mobility. We can avoid direct confrontation if necessary." "On paper, maybe," Jim countered. "But in the field with experienced crews on both sides, the margin for error is razor thin. We should be preparing for worst-case scenarios." Parker's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested in worst-case scenarios, Captain. I'm interested in completing this mission without an international incident. Need I remind you that I am in command of this operation?" "No, sir," Jim replied stiffly. "That's been made abundantly clear." "Good." Parker made a note on his clipboard. "Adjust your training accordingly. I want more emphasis on non-confrontational tactics and withdrawal procedures." Jim watched Parker walk away, his concern deepening. The lieutenant colonel's by-the-book approach might work in Pentagon war games, but against real tanks with real crews, it could prove disastrous. Later that evening, Jim was reviewing satellite imagery of the border region when Colonel Harrison entered the Tactical Operations Center. "Problem with Parker?" Harrison asked without preamble. Jim considered his response carefully. "Different perspectives on operational priorities, sir." Harrison chuckled without humor. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it." He sat down across from Jim, his weathered face serious. "Parker has his role to play, politically speaking. But I didn't bring you here for politics, Blackwood. I brought you here to win." "I understand, sir." "Good." Harrison slid a folder across the table. "New intelligence just came in. We've identified the commander of the T-72 unit." Jim opened the folder to find a grainy photograph of a stern-faced man in his 40s, with sharp cheekbones and cold, calculating eyes. "Colonel Nikolai Volkov," Harrison said, "former commander of the 150th Guards Tank Regiment, decorated veteran of Afghanistan, one of the Soviet Union's most experienced tank officers before he disappeared from their records 2 years ago. Apparently, the cartels pay better than the Red Army." Jim studied the photograph, feeling an inexplicable chill. Something about Volkov's eyes suggested a man who had seen too much combat, who had become comfortable with dealing death from inside a steel behemoth. "There's more," Harrison continued, his voice lowering despite the secure location. "Volkov was stationed in East Germany in 1980 during the same NATO exercises you participated in. He was on the other side of that simulated engagement where your tank company destroyed half the opposing force." Jim looked up sharply. "He was there?" Harrison nodded. "According to intelligence, he specifically requested information on American tank commanders who had served in Europe. Your name was on his list." The implications were disturbing. Volkov had been studying Jim's tactics, preparing for a potential confrontation. "He knows how I think," Jim said quietly. "And now you know he's out there," Harrison replied. "Use that knowledge, Blackwood, because I guarantee he's using what he knows about you." The following morning, as Jim's crew was conducting maintenance on their tank, An urgent message came through for all task force commanders to report to the command center immediately. Jim arrived to find the room buzzing with tense activity. Maps were being updated, and communications personnel were speaking rapidly into their headsets. Colonel Harrison stood at the center of the storm, his face grim as he conferred with intelligence officers. He looked up as Jim entered, motioning him over. Border Patrol station at Falcon Point was attacked 2 hours ago, Harrison said without preamble. 5 officers killed, the station destroyed. Witnesses reported tanks, at least 3 of them, bearing cartel markings. Jim felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Casualties? Total, Harrison confirmed. No survivors. The station was hit with 125-millimeter high-explosive rounds before the officers could even report contact. The room fell silent as Lieutenant Colonel Parker entered, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a tactical vest over his uniform. He joined Harrison and Jim, scanning the updated maps with evident concern. "This changes our timetable," Harrison continued. "The Pentagon is concerned that this attack could be a prelude to something bigger. Border Patrol is pulling back from isolated stations and consolidating their forces, creating a vacuum that the cartel can exploit," Jim observed. "Exactly," Harrison agreed. "CIA believes they're establishing a new smuggling corridor, one protected by armor that conventional Border Patrol units can't challenge." Parker cleared his throat. "Sir, my assessment is that we should maintain our surveillance posture until additional forces arrive. The M1s are valuable assets that shouldn't be risked prematurely." Jim couldn't contain himself. "With respect, sir, while we wait for reinforcements, more Americans will die. Those T-72s can outgun anything else we have in the region. The M1 is the only platform that can go head-to-head with them." Parker's face flushed with anger. "That's not your call to make, Captain." "Gentlemen," Harrison interrupted firmly, "this isn't the time for territorial disputes. We have a situation that requires immediate action." He turned to a large tactical map of the border region. "Intelligence suggests the cartel is establishing a staging area here in the Eagle Valley. It's approximately 30 miles from the border, secluded, with good road access for their supply lines. If we can confirm the presence of the T-72s, we'll have our opportunity." "An opportunity for what exactly?" Parker asked, his voice tense. Harrison's eyes were cold as steel. "To eliminate the threat, Colonel, permanently." "Sir," Parker protested, "the rules of engagement specifically state—" "I'm well aware of the rules of engagement," Harrison cut him off. "But those rules were written before we had Soviet tanks killing American law enforcement on American soil. The situation has evolved, and so must our response." He looked between Parker and Jim. "Captain Blackwood, prepare your tank and crew for immediate deployment. Colonel Parker, you'll coordinate with the other task force elements from the command center." Parker's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." As the meeting broke up, Jim approached Harrison privately. "Sir, may I speak freely?" Harrison nodded, leading Jim to a quiet corner of the room. "Parker's hesitation could get people killed," Jim said bluntly. "If we encounter the T-72s, we need clear, decisive orders, not political calculations." Harrison placed a hand on Jim's shoulder. "I understand your concern, Blackwood, but Parker serves a purpose. He ensures that all the paperwork is in order, that every action we take has proper authorization. That matters in this environment." "And in the field?" Jim pressed. "In the field," Harrison said quietly, "I trust you to do what's necessary. Just make sure you can justify it afterward." The message was clear. Jim would have operational freedom, but also ultimate responsibility. "One more thing," Harrison added, his voice dropping further. "New intelligence just came in. The cartel may be planning something big, possibly an attack on a border town to create a diversion while they move a major shipment through another sector." "Do we know the target?" Jim asked. "Not definitively, but Eagle Pass is the most likely. It's got a small police force, minimal Border Patrol presence since the consolidation, and it's positioned at a strategic crossing point." The mention of Eagle Pass sent a chill down Jim's spine. "Sir, Eagle Pass has a school with over 400 children. If those tanks open fire on the town, then you understand the stakes," Harrison said grimly. "Find those T-72s, Blackwood. Find them and stop them before they can carry out whatever Volkov is planning." Jim returned to the motor pool with a renewed sense of urgency, gathering his crew around the tank. "The situation has changed," he told them, not mincing words. "The T-72s have made their first move, attacking a Border Patrol station and killing 5 Americans. We're deploying immediately to the Eagle Valley region to locate and engage these tanks before they can threaten civilian populations." Donovan nodded, his expression resolute. About damn time. Mendez crossed himself quickly. Those poor border patrol guys never had a chance. Thompson, the young driver, looked pale but determined. What's the plan, sir? We'll be conducting a reconnaissance along these routes, Jim explained, unfolding a map across the tank's hull. Intelligence believes the cartel has established a staging area in this valley. Our job is to confirm that intelligence and, if necessary, engage and destroy any T-72s we encounter. If necessary? Donovan questioned, raising an eyebrow. Those are the official orders, Jim clarified. Unofficially, Colonel Harrison has made it clear that these tanks represent a clear and present danger that must be eliminated. The men exchanged glances, understanding the subtext. They would be operating in a gray area with potential political ramifications regardless of their actions. One more thing, Jim added, his voice somber. The commander of the enemy tanks is a Soviet colonel named Nikolai Volkov. He's a decorated combat veteran who knows his business. These won't be cartel thugs randomly firing cannons. They'll be professional tankers executing deliberate tactics. He looked each man in the eye. This will be the real thing, gentlemen. The most dangerous mission any of you have faced. If anyone wants to step away, now is the time. No questions asked, no consequences. No one moved. Thompson swallowed hard but squared his shoulders, refusing to be the one to back down. We're with you, Captain. Donovan spoke for all of them. Jim nodded, feeling simultaneously proud of their courage and burdened by his responsibility for their lives. Then let's get our gear stowed. We move out in 1 hour. As Donovan and Mendez began preparing the tank, Thompson lingered behind, clearly troubled. Something on your mind, Private? Jim asked. Thompson hesitated before speaking. Sir, this will be my first real combat mission. I don't want to let the team down. Jim saw the genuine fear behind the young man's bravado, remembering his own first combat mission in Vietnam. The fear never truly disappeared, but you learned to function despite it. My father was a tanker in World War II, Jim said, deciding Thompson needed perspective more than platitudes. He landed at Normandy with the 2nd Armored Division. On his first day in combat, his tank was hit 3 times. The third hit penetrated and killed his gunner instantly. Thompson listened intently as Jim continued. Dad said he was terrified, convinced he was about to die. But he stayed at his position, kept the tank moving, and got the rest of the crew to safety. Later, he couldn't even remember driving off the beach. His training just took over. Jim placed a hand on Thompson's shoulder. That's why we've been drilling so hard. When the moment comes, your training will carry you through. Trust it, trust your crew, and we'll get through this together. Thompson nodded, visibly gathering his resolve. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. An hour later, the task force moved out. A column of 5 M1 Abrams tanks heading south toward the border. Jim's tank led the formation, with Parker coordinating from a command Humvee at the rear. They traveled under the cover of darkness, using the Abrams thermal imaging systems to navigate without headlights. Inside Jim's tank, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Each man was absorbed in his duties. Thompson carefully navigating the difficult terrain, Donovan continuously scanning for threats through the thermal sight, and Mendez ensuring that the main gun was loaded and ready to fire at a moment's notice. Jim alternated between monitoring the tactical radio and studying the terrain through his commander's independent thermal viewer. The landscape appeared as a ghostly panorama of varying heat signatures, rocks and vegetation cooler than the surrounding earth after the day's heat. As they approached the suspected staging area, Jim ordered the column to halt and establish a defensive position on a ridgeline overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, they could observe without being immediately detected, especially in the darkness. Jim raised his binoculars, enhanced with the latest night vision technology, and scanned the valley below. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the expected terrain features. Then a faint heat signature caught his attention, too regular to be natural. Donovan, he said quietly into his headset, target 2 o'clock, approximately 2,500 meters. Can you confirm? Donovan swiveled the gunner's sight to the indicated bearing. I see it, sir. Definite vehicle signature. Large, tracked, consistent with a main battle tank. Jim's pulse quickened. Can you make out any identifying features? Negative, sir. It's partially concealed behind that rock formation, but the thermal profile matches what we'd expect from a T-72. Jim switched to the command frequency. All units, this is Sabre 1. Possible contact, grid reference Echo 47. Hold positions and maintain visual scanning. Parker's voice came back immediately, tense and uncertain. Sabre 1, this is command. Are you confirming hostile presence? Command Saber 1, we have a probable T-72 signature at extreme range, requesting permission to advance to a better observation position. There was a pause before Parker responded. Negative, Saber 1. Maintain your current position until we can get aerial confirmation. Jim gritted his teeth in frustration. Every instinct told him they needed to act quickly, to seize the initiative before they lost the element of surprise. Command, aerial assets are still 90 minutes out, he reminded Parker. If this is the cartel staging area, we need to confirm it now while we still have darkness as cover. Another pause, longer this time. Jim could almost see Parker consulting his rulebook, weighing his career against the operational necessity. Finally, Harrison's voice cut in on the command channel. All units, this is actual. Saber 1 is authorized to conduct close reconnaissance with his tank only. Remainder of the force will hold position and provide overwatch. Copy that, actual, Jim acknowledged, relief evident in his voice. Saber 1 moving to investigate. He switched to the internal crew channel. Thompson, take us forward, nice and slow. Use the terrain for concealment. Donovan, keep that gun trained on the target area. Mendez, ready an armor-piercing round. The Abrams began to move, its gas turbine engine producing a distinctive whine that was quieter than the diesel engines of older tanks but still audible in the night air. Thompson guided the massive vehicle with surprising delicacy, using natural depressions and rock formations to mask their approach. As they drew closer, Jim could make out more details through his viewer. What had been a vague heat signature resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of a T-72, its distinctive turret and long gun barrel visible despite camouflage netting. Contact confirmed, Jim reported. One T-72, possibly more, concealed in the area, no visible personnel. He was about to order Thompson to reposition for a better view of the entire valley when a sudden flash of light to their right caught his attention. Before he could react, the night erupted with the distinctive crack of a tank cannon firing. Incoming, Jim shouted as an explosion rocked the ground 30 meters to their left, showering the Abrams with dirt and rocks. The ambush had been sprung. As their eyes recovered from the muzzle flash, Jim could now see what they had missed. A second T-72 positioned on the valley's eastern slope, its thermal signature masked by the heat-absorbing rocks around it. Thompson, evasive maneuvers. Donovan, target that firing tank. The Abrams surged forward as Thompson responded instantly to the command, using the tank's exceptional mobility to present a moving target. Meanwhile, Donovan swiveled the turret toward the threat, the stabilization system keeping the gun steady despite the tank's movement. Target acquired, Donovan reported coolly. Range 1,800 meters. Fire when ready, Jim ordered. The Abrams rocked with the recoil as its 105mm gun belched flame into the night. Mendez was already reaching for another round before the first had even reached its target. His movements practiced and efficient. Through his viewer, Jim watched as their round struck the T-72 squarely on its turret front. For a moment, nothing happened, and Jim feared the round had failed to penetrate. Then, a sudden, catastrophic explosion tore through the Soviet tank as its ammunition detonated, sending its turret cartwheeling into the air in a spectacle of destruction that illuminated the valley. Target destroyed, Donovan confirmed unnecessarily. But there was no time to celebrate. The valley had come alive with activity. Jim could now see at least 3 more T-72s moving into firing positions, their initial concealment abandoned as they sought to bring their guns to bear on the lone Abrams. Command Saber 1, Jim called urgently. We are under fire from multiple T-72s. Request immediate support. Parker's voice was high with stress. Saber 1, pull back to the main force immediately. That's an order. Jim was about to comply when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind the advancing T-72s, he could see a column of trucks and lighter vehicles, all heading toward a road that led directly to Eagle Pass. This wasn't just a staging area. It was the beginning of the attack Harrison had warned about. Command, they're moving on Eagle Pass, Jim reported. We need to engage now or civilians will die. Harrison's voice cut through the chatter. All Saber units, advance and engage. Stop those tanks at all costs. The rest of the M1s began moving forward from their overwatch positions, but Jim knew they would take precious minutes to reach effective firing range. Minutes that would allow the T-72s to break through and begin their advance toward the town. Thompson, position us between those tanks and the road to Eagle Pass, Jim ordered. Donovan, target the lead vehicle in that column. Mendez, load high explosive. As the Abrams maneuvered into position, Jim could see one of the T-72s turning to face them directly. Through his thermal viewer, he could make out the tank's commander standing in the turret, observing through binoculars. Something about the figure's posture, the confident way he directed his crew even under fire, told Jim exactly who he was facing. Volkov, he muttered. It was as if the Soviet colonel had heard him. The T-72's turret swiveled with deliberate precision, its gun elevating slightly to account for the range. Jim knew they had only seconds before the shot. "Thompson, hard right," he shouted. The Abrams lurched as Thompson threw it into a sharp turn. The move came just in time as a 125mm round screamed through the space they had occupied a moment before, close enough that Jim could feel the pressure wave of its passing. Donovan didn't wait for orders. The Abrams gun roared again, sending a round directly at Volkov's tank. But Volkov was already moving, his T-72 backing behind a rock formation that absorbed the shot in a shower of stone fragments. "He's good," Donovan said with grudging professional respect. "Keep him busy," Jim replied. "We need to hold them here until the rest of the force arrives." For the next few minutes, the lone Abrams danced a deadly ballet with the T-72s, using its superior mobility and fire control to prevent any of the Soviet tanks from breaking through toward Eagle Pass. Two more T-72s erupted in flames under Donovan's precise gunnery, but Volkov's tank remained elusive, using terrain features for cover and emerging only to fire carefully aimed shots that forced the Abrams to keep moving. The rest of the American tank force had finally reached effective range and begun engaging the remaining T-72s, but the fight was far from over. Jim's attention was divided between directing his crew and coordinating with the other tanks when a thunderous impact rocked the Abrams. Warning lights flashed as the tanks shuddered under the hit. Acrid smoke filled the compartment, and Jim could hear the fire suppression system activating automatically. "Status report," he called, coughing through the smoke. "Engine hit," Thompson shouted back. "We're losing power." "Turret rotation compromised," Donovan added. "Hydraulic system failing." Jim felt a moment of dread. A disabled tank was a dead tank on this battlefield. "Can we move at all, Thompson?" The young driver was wrestling with the unresponsive controls. "Maybe, sir, but not fast or far." Jim made a split-second decision. "Get us behind that ridgeline for cover. We'll fight from a stationary position." As Thompson coaxed the wounded Abrams toward the meager protection of the ridgeline, Jim scanned for the tank that had hit them. He found it immediately. Volkov's T-72, advancing boldly now that it had crippled the most effective opposition. Through his viewer, Jim could see Volkov clearly now, standing in his turret despite the danger, directing his force with the confidence of a commander who sensed victory within grasp. Their eyes seemed to meet across the battlefield, a moment of recognition between two professional soldiers. "Donovan," Jim said quietly, "can you still get a firing solution?" The gunner's voice was grim but determined. "Turret's jammed at current bearing. If he moves into our sights, I can hit him. Otherwise—" "Understood." Jim weighed his options rapidly. They were damaged but not destroyed. The rest of the American force was fully engaged with the remaining T-72s. Volkov's tank was advancing toward the road to Eagle Pass, and there was nothing standing in his way except Jim's crippled Abrams. Jim glanced down at a small photograph taped inside his commander's station. It showed a smiling woman holding a young girl of about 8. Sarah, his daughter, would be waiting for him to come home from this training exercise. "We're not done yet," he said with quiet determination. "Thompson, on my mark, I want you to drive straight at Volkov's tank." "Sir?" Thompson's voice cracked with disbelief. "We can't rotate the turret, but we can rotate the entire tank," Jim explained. "Donovan needs a shot, and we're going to give him one." Understanding dawned on the crew's faces. It was a desperate move, exposing their vulnerable sides and rear to enemy fire to bring their gun to bear. But it was their only remaining option. "Everyone ready?" Jim asked, looking at each member of his crew. Donovan's eyes were steady, his hands firm on the fire controls. Mendez had already loaded another armor-piercing round, his jaws set in determination. Thompson's young face was pale but resolute as he gripped the driver's controls. "For Sarah," Jim whispered, touching the photograph. Then louder, "Execute." The damaged Abrams lurched forward, its engine screaming in protest as Thompson pushed it to its limits. Across the valley, Jim could see Volkov recognizing the threat, his T-72's turret swiveling to target the charging American tank. It would come down to seconds now. Whoever fired first, whoever hit first, would determine not just their fates, but the fate of countless civilians in Eagle Pass who had no idea that their lives hung in the balance of this desert duel. As the gap closed between the two steel titans, Jim felt an odd sense of clarity. Everything he had experienced in his military career, Vietnam, the training exercises in Germany, the countless hours studying tank tactics, had prepared him for this moment. Win or lose, he would face it with the courage and determination that had defined his life as a soldier. "For Eagle Pass," he said to his crew, "for America." The night erupted in fire as both tanks fired simultaneously, two steel giants locked in a duel to the death as the fate of innocents hung in the balance. Fort Hood, Texas Veterans Reunion, 2090. Colonel James "Iron Jim" Blackwood paused in his narrative, the banquet hall absolutely silent as the assembled veterans hung on his every word. The skeptical captain who had challenged him earlier now leaned forward, completely engrossed in the story. "What happened next?" someone finally asked, breaking the spell. Jim smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "That, my friends, is the story for another time. But I will tell you this. I'm standing here today, and Eagle Pass never made the evening news that night." He held up the twisted piece of metal once more. "This is my reminder of what happened in that valley, of the men who fought alongside me, and of the enemy commander who taught me that courage knows no nationality." As the crowd erupted in applause, Jim tucked the metal fragment back into his pocket, next to a faded photograph of a woman and a young girl that he had carried for over 3 decades. Some stories were written in history books, studied and analyzed by generations of officers. Others, like what happened in Eagle Valley in 1986, remained in the memories of those who lived them, shared only with those who had earned the right to hear them. But all stories of courage, sacrifice, and duty serve the same purpose: to remind those who came after what it truly meant to be a soldier, to stand between danger and those who could not protect themselves, regardless of the hunt. And as Jim looked out at the younger veterans, he saw in their eyes that they understood. Some burdens were carried silently, some battles fought without recognition, but none without purpose or honor. That was the legacy of the tank commanders who had come before, and it would be the legacy of those yet to come. The desert night exploded into day as both tanks fired simultaneously. Through his viewer, Jim watched as their armor-piercing rounds streaked toward Volkov's T-72, leaving a phosphorescent trail in the darkness. At the same instant, he saw the muzzle flash of the Soviet tank's 125mm gun, its own round racing toward them with deadly intent. Time seemed to stretch as Jim tracked both projectiles. Donovan's aim was true, the round striking the T-72 at the junction between its turret and hull, but it didn't penetrate. Instead, it ricocheted upward in a shower of sparks, leaving only a dent in the Soviet armor. "Glancing hit!" Donovan shouted in frustration. Before Jim could respond, the world turned upside down. Volkov's round struck their already damaged right track assembly, the explosion lifting the 60-ton Abrams partially off the ground before slamming it back down. Warning lights flashed across every control panel as systems failed throughout the vehicle. "Status," Jim demanded, fighting through the disorientation. "Mobility kill," Thompson reported, his young voice strained but professional. "We're not going anywhere, sir." "Turret power's gone," Donovan added, switching to manual traverse. In a functioning Abrams, the gunner could rotate the turret with effortless precision using electronic controls. With those systems down, Donovan would have to use the manual crank, physically turning the massive turret through muscle power alone. It was brutally slow, but it was their only option. Jim keyed his radio, needing to alert the rest of the force to their situation. Static answered him. The impact had damaged their communications equipment as well. Through the periscopes, Jim could see Volkov's T-72 circling for another shot, like a predator sizing up wounded prey. The Soviet commander was taking his time, confident in his advantage. "Mendez, load another sabot round," Jim ordered. "Donovan, start traversing left. Let's see if we can bring the gun to bear before he gets his next shot." Mendez slammed another armor-piercing round into the breech with practiced efficiency, while Donovan began the grueling process of manually rotating the turret. The mechanism groaned in protest, moving with agonizing slowness. Jim watched Volkov's tank through his viewer, calculating angles and timing. The T-72 was moving laterally across their field of fire, maintaining distance while seeking an optimal firing position. If they could get the gun around in time, they might have one last chance. "Sir," Thompson called from the driver's position, "I've got a bypass for the auxiliary power unit. Might give us enough juice to rotate the turret electronically for a few seconds." Hope surged through Jim. "Do it, Thompson." The young driver's hands moved across his control panel, bypassing safety systems and rerouting power. It was a dangerous jury rig that could potentially cause an electrical fire, but their alternatives were non-existent. "Ready on your command, sir," Thompson reported. Jim waited, watching Volkov's tank through his periscope. The T-72 had stopped moving and was now rotating its turret toward them for what would likely be a killing shot. "Now, Thompson!" The Abrams turret suddenly lurched into motion, rotating with surprising speed as Thompson's bypass fed emergency power to the system. Donovan reacted instantly, adjusting his aim as the gun swung toward the T-72. "Target acquired," he called. "Fire," Jim ordered. The Abrams main gun roared, its muzzle flash illuminating the darkness. Through his viewer, Jim watched the round streak across the distance and strike the T-72 squarely on its frontal armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as the specialized armor-piercing round completed its work, a brilliant flash erupted from the Soviet tank as its ammunition began cooking off. The T-72's turret lifted partially from the hull before settling back, smoke pouring from every hatch. It wasn't the catastrophic turret ejection that often characterized T-72 kills, but the tank was clearly disabled. "Target neutralized," Donovan confirmed, his voice steady despite the tension. Jim allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before assessing their situation. They were immobilized with limited electrical power and no communications. The rest of the American force was engaged with the remaining T-72s further down the valley, unaware of their predicament. "Thompson, any chance of getting us mobile again?" Jim asked, though he already knew the answer. "Negative, sir," Thompson replied. "The track assembly is completely destroyed, and we've got damage to the road wheels and suspension. We're not moving without a recovery vehicle." Jim nodded, having expected as much. "Mendez, break out the emergency radio. Let's see if we can establish communications with the rest of the force." As Mendez retrieved the backup communications equipment, Jim continued to monitor the battlefield through his periscope. The firefight was intensifying to the south, where the remaining American tanks were engaging the cartel forces. But something about the battle pattern troubled him. The T-72s seemed to be focusing on drawing the American tanks away from the road to Eagle Pass rather than pressing toward the town directly. "It's a diversion," Jim muttered, realization dawning. "They're trying to keep us occupied while something else happens." Mendez had set up the emergency radio and was attempting to establish contact with the other tanks. "No response, sir," he reported after several attempts. "Either they're out of range or something's jamming our signal." Jim considered their options. They were effectively out of the fight as far as their tank was concerned, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the real threat to Eagle Pass remained unaddressed. "We need to get eyes on that convoy," he decided. "Donovan, Thompson, secure the tank. Mendez, bring the radio, night vision gear, and your sidearm. We're going to do some recon on foot." The crew exchanged surprised glances. Abandoning a tank, even a disabled one, was a serious decision. "Sir," Donovan began hesitantly, "regulations state that—" "I know what the regulations state, Sergeant," Jim interrupted. "But something bigger is happening here, and we're the only ones who can find out what it is. We'll come back for the tank once we've assessed the situation." The men nodded, their training overcoming their reluctance. They secured their stations and gathered the necessary equipment. Before leaving, Jim made one final check of the T-72 they had disabled. Through his thermal viewer, he could see that the tank was still hot from the internal fire, but there was no movement around it. The crew had either perished or abandoned their vehicle. The night air felt surprisingly cool after the confines of the tank. Jim oriented himself using the stars in the terrain, then led his crew toward a ridgeline that would offer a view of the convoy route without exposing them to detection. They moved silently through the desert landscape, using natural cover and their night vision equipment to avoid the scattered cartel forces. The ridgeline was a half-mile away, a distance that would have been trivial in their tank, but represented a challenging trek on foot through hostile territory. As they approached their objective, Jim signaled for the men to take cover behind a cluster of boulders. Ahead, he could see movement along the road. Vehicles with headlights darkened, moving in a disciplined column toward the north. "Not toward Eagle Pass," Mendez observed, confusion evident in his voice. "They're heading away from the town." Jim raised his night vision binoculars, studying the convoy. The vehicles were primarily large trucks, escorted by technicals, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns. But one truck near the center of the formation caught his attention. It was larger than the others, with a distinctive shape that suggested a specialized transport of some kind. "That's not a drug shipment," Jim said quietly. "That's a weapons transport." "What kind of weapons?" Thompson asked, the youngest member of the crew still learning to read the subtle cues that experienced soldiers recognized. Something big, Jim replied. Something worth all this effort. Suddenly, the night was shattered by an explosion to the south, where the main battle was taking place. Even at this distance, they could see the distinctive fireball of an Abrams cooking off after a catastrophic hit. They got one of ours, Donovan said grimly. The knowledge that American tankers, men they had trained with, eaten with, lived alongside, were dying added urgency to their mission. Whatever the cartel was moving, it was worth American lives to them. We need to get closer to that convoy, Jim decided. If we can identify what they're transporting, we can better assess the threat. Sir, Mendez said hesitantly, if we get spotted, we've got no armor, no heavy weapons, just our sidearms against who knows how many tangos. I'm aware of the risks, Sergeant, Jim replied. But the alternative is letting that convoy disappear into the night with unknown capabilities that could threaten American civilians. The men nodded, accepting his reasoning. They began making their way down from the ridgeline, using the terrain for concealment as they closed the distance to the convoy route. The going was slow and dangerous, with cartel spotters potentially lurking in the darkness. They had covered about half the distance when Thompson suddenly froze, holding up a hand in warning. Jim instantly dropped to a crouch, signaling the others to take cover. Ahead, barely visible in the darkness, two figures were walking a patrol route, AK-47s slung across their chests. Jim signaled his crew to hold position as he assessed the situation. The patrol was following a predictable pattern, moving back and forth along a 100-meter stretch of ground that blocked their most direct approach to the convoy. They would need to either eliminate the patrol silently or find a way around. Before Jim could formulate a plan, the situation changed dramatically. One of the patrollers raised a hand to his ear, apparently receiving a radio transmission. Both men then turned and began jogging toward the convoy, abandoning their patrol route. Something's happening, Jim whispered. They're being recalled. Taking advantage of the unexpected opportunity, Jim led his crew forward, crossing the patrol area quickly while remaining vigilant for other guards. As they drew closer to the convoy route, the reason for the patrol's recall became apparent. The entire column was picking up pace, transitioning from a cautious advance to a more urgent movement. They know their diversion isn't working anymore, Jim surmised. They're accelerating the timetable. Finding cover behind a low rise about 200 meters from the road, the crew watched as the convoy passed. Jim counted 12 vehicles total, 8 cargo trucks, 3 escort technicals, and the specialized transport he had noticed earlier. Now, from this closer vantage point, he could make out more details of the unusual vehicle. That's a mobile missile launcher, he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Soviet design, probably an SS-21 Scarab. Donovan swore softly. A tactical ballistic missile. What the hell are they planning to do with that? Jim's mind raced through the implications. The SS-21 was a short-range ballistic missile system capable of delivering conventional nuclear or chemical warheads up to 120 kilometers. It was not the kind of weapon drug cartels typically employed. This isn't just about drugs, he concluded. Someone's using the cartel as cover for something much bigger. Volkov, Mendez suggested. Maybe he's not just a mercenary. Maybe he's still working for the Soviets. It was a disturbing possibility, one that elevated the stakes of their mission from a border security operation to a matter of national security. If Soviet military assets were operating covertly on American soil, the geopolitical implications were enormous. We need to alert command immediately, Jim said, turning to Mendez. Try the radio again. Mendez worked with the emergency radio, attempting to find a frequency that wasn't being jammed. After several tense minutes, he shook his head in frustration. Still nothing, sir. The jamming is comprehensive. Jim weighed their options. They could attempt to return to their disabled tank and wait for the rest of the force to find them, but that could take hours, by which time the missile launcher would be long gone. Alternatively, they could continue tracking the convoy on foot, but their ability to intervene would be severely limited without heavy weapons. A third option formed in Jim's mind, risky but potentially effective. The T-72, he said, drawing confused looks from his crew. Sir? Thompson questioned. Volkov's T-72, Jim clarified. The one we disabled. If it's not completely destroyed, we might be able to use it. Understanding dawned on the men's faces, followed quickly by concern. Captain, Donovan said, none of us has been trained on Soviet equipment. Even if the tank is operable, we might not be able to figure out the controls. I've studied the T-72 extensively, Jim countered. Part of my training at the armor school included familiarization with Soviet tank systems. I can't promise it'll be pretty, but I can operate the basic functions. The men exchanged glances, weighing the audacity of the plan against their limited alternatives. It beats taking on a missile launcher with pistols, Mendez finally said, a grim smile crossing his face. With their decision made, the crew began making their way back toward the Diebold T-72, moving carefully to avoid detection by cartel patrols. The journey was tense, each man acutely aware that discovery would mean certain death in their vulnerable state. As they approached the Soviet tank, Jim signaled for them to take cover while he assessed the vehicle's condition. The thermal signature had cooled significantly, suggesting that any fires inside had burned themselves out. There was no movement around the tank, confirming his earlier observation that the crew was either dead or had abandoned it. Using his night vision equipment, Jim examined the exterior of the T-72 for signs of catastrophic damage. Their final shot had certainly disabled it, but the tank appeared structurally intact. The main question was whether the internal systems, particularly the engine and transmission, were still functional. Jim approached the tank cautiously, climbing onto the hull and examining the turret hatch. It was partially open, suggesting that at least some of the crew had managed to escape. Drawing his sidearm, he slowly opened the hatch further and peered inside, ready to fire if he encountered resistance. The interior was dark and smelled of burned electronics and hydraulic fluid. Jim activated a small tactical flashlight, illuminating the cramped fighting compartment. The gunner's position was empty, but a motionless figure slumped in the commander's seat. The man wore a Soviet tanker's uniform, his face obscured by his helmet. Jim checked for signs of life, finding none. The commander had apparently been killed by spalling, fragments of the tank's own armor that had broken free under the impact of their round and ricocheted lethally around the interior. "Clear," Jim called quietly to his crew. "One KIA, no other personnel." The men joined him at the tank, maintaining security while Jim continued his assessment. He moved to the driver's compartment, located at the front of the hull rather than in the turret as in American tanks. This separate compartment, accessed through its own hatch, was a distinctive feature of Soviet tank design that Jim had studied but never experienced firsthand. Opening the driver's hatch, Jim found the compartment empty. The driver had apparently escaped after the tank was disabled. This was a stroke of luck, as it gave Jim immediate access to the T-72's mobility systems. "Donovan, check the autoloader and ammunition status," Jim ordered as he examined the driver's station. "Mendez, secure any documents or maps you can find. Thompson, you're with me. I need to figure out if this thing can still move." The men dispersed to their tasks, working quickly and efficiently despite the unfamiliar environment. Jim slid into the driver's seat, which was far more cramped than the equivalent position in an Abrams. The controls were fundamentally similar to those of other tanks, a pair of tiller bars for steering, foot pedals for acceleration and braking. But the specific layout and response characteristics would be different. Thompson peered over Jim's shoulder, studying the foreign control panel with professional curiosity. "Can you read any of this, sir?" he asked, gesturing to the Cyrillic labels on the instruments. "Enough to get by," Jim replied. "This one's the tachometer, this is the temperature gauge, and this should be the fuel level." The fuel gauge showed nearly half a tank, which was promising. Jim's attention turned to the starting system. Unlike American tanks with their sophisticated electronic ignition systems, the T-72 used a more rudimentary pneumatic starter that was mechanically actuated. "Let's see if this beast still has some life in it," Jim muttered, locating the starter control. Before attempting to start the engine, he made a quick check for obvious damage to the drivetrain. There were warning indicators illuminated on the panel, but nothing that suggested catastrophic failure. The T-72 was renowned for its ruggedness and ability to function despite significant damage. Jim took a deep breath and activated the starter. The tank shuddered as the pneumatic system engaged, followed by a series of mechanical groans as the massive diesel engine turned over. For a moment, it seemed the engine wouldn't catch, but then it roared to life, filling the compartment with its distinctive rumble. "We've got power," Jim called to the others, feeling a surge of triumph. Donovan appeared at the turret hatch, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Autoloader seems functional, sir. We've got 14 rounds remaining in the carousel. Mix of high explosive and armor piercing." "Any signs of damage to the firing system?" Jim asked. "Nothing obvious, but I can't guarantee anything. Soviet electronics are different from ours." Jim nodded, accepting the uncertainty as part of their improvised plan. "Mendez, any luck with documents?" Mendez climbed down from the turret, a small leather case in hand. Found this in the commander's position, sir. Maps, what looks like orders in Russian, in some kind of code book. Good work. Those could be valuable to intelligence if we make it back. Jim turned to his crew. Here's the situation. We have a functional armed T-72 tank. We have a convoy carrying a Soviet tactical missile system heading north. And we have no communication with our forces. Our mission is clear. Intercept that convoy and neutralize the missile threat by any means necessary. The men nodded, their faces resolute despite the audacity of what they were proposing. Positions, Jim ordered. Donovan, you're in the gunner's seat. Your controls will be similar to ours, but with different ergonomics. Mendez, you'll need to assist with loading if the autoloader fails. Thompson, I need you to navigate from the commander's position while I drive. We'll rotate responsibilities as needed once we get comfortable with the systems. The crew took their assigned positions, quickly familiarizing themselves with the foreign equipment. Jim engaged the transmission, feeling the T-72's tracks begin to move. The tank responded differently from the Abrams he was accustomed to, with less refined control inputs and more mechanical feedback through the tiller bars. But it moved, and that was what mattered. They set off in pursuit of the convoy, following the tracks it had left in the desert soil. Jim kept their speed moderate, balancing the need for haste against the necessity of mastering the unfamiliar controls. As they traveled, each man worked to understand his station better, calling out discoveries and challenges. The targeting system is more primitive than ours, Donovan reported from the gunner's position. No thermal imaging, just an optical rangefinder and basic night vision. The turret traverses more slowly too, Mendez added, and the autoloader has a rhythm to it we'll need to work with. It can only sustain a fire rate of about 8 rounds per minute. Jim absorbed this information, mentally comparing the Soviet tank's capabilities to those of the Abrams they had left behind. The T-72 was undeniably inferior in many respects, slower, less protected, with cruder fire control systems. But it was operational, armed, and their only hope of stopping the missile launcher. After approximately 20 minutes of travel, Thompson spotted lights in the distance. Convoy ahead, sir, about 3 kilometers and moving at speed. Jim calculated their approach. Given the T-72's top road speed of around 60 kilometers per hour, they could potentially overtake the convoy, but it would be a close thing. And once they engaged, they would be outnumbered and facing multiple threats from different directions. We need a plan of attack, he said, thinking aloud. The missile launcher is the primary target, but those escort vehicles will have heavy machine guns at minimum, possibly RPGs or other anti-tank weapons. Could we use terrain to our advantage? Thompson suggested. Find a position ahead of them and ambush as they pass. Jim considered the idea. The convoy is following this valley north. There's a narrowing about 5 kilometers ahead where the road passes between 2 ridgelines. If we can get there first, we could engage from an elevated position. Like shooting fish in a barrel, Donovan said with grim satisfaction. Exactly. But we'll need to push this tank to its limits to get there in time. Jim increased their speed, feeling the T-72's engine strain as it accelerated to its maximum. The tank rattled and vibrated more violently than an Abrams would at similar speed, a testament to the different design philosophies and manufacturing standards of American and Soviet equipment. The race against time was tense, with Jim constantly checking their position against landmarks and estimating the convoy's progress. The T-72's lack of sophisticated navigation equipment meant they were relying on basic map reading and terrain recognition, skills that Jim had honed during his time in Vietnam, but that added another layer of challenge to their already difficult mission. As they approached the narrowing in the valley, Jim ordered Thompson to use the night vision periscope to check for signs of the convoy. Nothing yet, sir, but we should have about 10 minutes before they arrive, based on their last observed speed. That gives us just enough time to set up our position, Jim said, guiding the T-72 up a steep incline that led to one of the ridgelines overlooking the road. The Soviet tank struggled with the grade, its suspension groaning under the strain, but ultimately conquered the slope. From their elevated position, they had an excellent view of the road below. Jim maneuvered the tank behind a large rock formation that provided both concealment and cover, leaving only the turret exposed to engaged targets. Donovan, traverse the turret and establish fields of fire, Jim ordered, switching from the driver's position to join the others in the fighting compartment. Mendez, verify ammunition status and ensure the autoloader is functioning. Thompson, keep watch for the convoy's approach. The men worked quickly, adapting to the unfamiliar Soviet equipment with the versatility that characterized experienced soldiers. Jim studied the T-72's fire control system, which lacked the sophisticated computer assistance of the Abrams, but still provided basic range finding and targeting capabilities. Convoy spotted, Thompson announced after several minutes. 7 vehicles remaining, same configuration as before. Missile launcher is fourth in line. Jim took over the commander's position, using the periscopes to observe the approaching convoy. They were maintaining a steady pace, their darkened headlights barely visible in the night. The escort vehicles were positioned at the front, rear, and alongside the missile launcher, providing comprehensive protection. "Here's the plan," Jim said decisively. "We engage the lead escort vehicle first to block the road. Then we target the rear escort to prevent retreat. With the convoy halted, we concentrate fire on the missile launcher itself." The crew acknowledged the plan, each man mentally preparing for his role. Jim felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded combat, a mixture of anxiety and heightened awareness that he had first experienced in Vietnam and had never quite forgotten. "Range to lead vehicle, 1,000 meters, and closing," Thompson reported. "Target the lead technical," Jim ordered. Donovan aligned the gun sight on the first escort vehicle, adjusting for the range and the T-72's ballistic characteristics. "Target acquired." "Wait for my command," Jim said, watching as the convoy drew closer. He wanted them well into the narrowing of the valley where their options for evasion would be limited. Steady, steady. The convoy entered the kill zone, the vehicles maintaining their tight formation as they passed between the ridgelines. "Fire," Jim ordered. The T-72's 125mm gun roared, the recoil rocking the tank despite its substantial weight. Through his periscope, Jim watched as the high-explosive round struck the lead technical directly, transforming it into a fireball that illuminated the night. The wreckage blocked the narrow road, bringing the rest of the convoy to an abrupt halt. "Target destroyed," Donovan confirmed, engaging rear escort. The autoloader whirred as it cycled a new round into the breach, its mechanical rhythm different from the manual loading process in an Abrams. Donovan adjusted his aim to the rearmost vehicle, which was already attempting to maneuver for a better position. "Fire when ready," Jim authorized. The gun thundered again, sending another high-explosive round downrange. This shot struck just behind the rear technical, showering it with debris but not destroying it outright. The vehicle accelerated, trying to escape the ambush. "Adjusting," Donovan said calmly, making minute corrections to his aim. The gun fired again, this time striking the technical squarely and flipping it onto its side in a shower of sparks and flame. "Path blocked front and rear," Jim confirmed. "Now for the primary target, load armor-piercing." The autoloader cycled again, selecting an armor-piercing round from its carousel and loading it into the breach. Donovan shifted his aim to the missile launcher, which was now attempting to turn around in the confined space of the road. "They're trying to protect the launcher," Thompson observed. "The remaining technical is positioning itself between us and the target." Indeed, the escort vehicle had moved to shield the missile launcher, its mounted heavy machine gun now firing in their general direction. Most rounds were striking the rock formation protecting them, but it was only a matter of time before the gunner found his range. "We'll need to neutralize that technical first," Jim decided. "Donovan, switch back to high explosive." The gunner complied, the autoloader cycling to select the appropriate ammunition type. As they prepared to engage, Jim noticed movement on his right periscope. A group of cartel fighters was attempting to flank their position, climbing the ridgeline with what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. "Threats right," Jim called out. "Mendez, get on the coaxial machine gun and suppress those infantry." Mendez moved to the appropriate controls, swiveling the T-72's 7.62mm coaxial machine gun toward the approaching fighters. He opened fire, sending a stream of tracers into the darkness. The cartel fighters scattered, seeking cover among the rocks, but continued their advance. "They're trying to pin us down while the convoy escapes," Jim realized. "Donovan, priority is still the technical blocking our shot at the launcher." Donovan fired, the high-explosive round striking near the technical but not scoring a direct hit. The escort vehicle continued firing its heavy machine gun, rounds now pinging off the T-72's turret armor. "Reloading," Donovan reported as the autoloader cycled. Jim assessed their deteriorating situation. They were facing threats from multiple directions. The primary target was attempting to escape, and they were still mastering the unfamiliar controls of the Soviet tank. It was a scenario that demanded decisive action. "Mendez, continue suppressing the infantry," he ordered. "Thompson, take over the main gun from Donovan. Donovan, I need you to get a better view of the battlefield. The men shifted positions, adapting to the changing tactical situation. Thompson, though primarily trained as a driver, had received cross-training on the Abrams's fire control system and could operate the T-72's simpler gun sight effectively enough for close-range engagement. Target the technical, Jim directed him. Fire when ready. Thompson lined up the shot, compensating for the technical's movement in the range. The gun fired, the round passing just over the vehicle without impact. Adjusting, Thompson said, his young voice steady despite the pressure. Meanwhile, Mendez was engaged in a fierce firefight with the flanking infantry. The coaxial machine gun chattered continuously, keeping the cartel fighters at bay, but not eliminating the threat. RPG, Donovan suddenly shouted from his observation position. Jim caught a glimpse of the rocket-propelled grenade just before it struck the side of their turret. The impact was deafening, the shockwave reverberating through the tank's interior. Warning indicators lit up across the control panels, but the T-72's substantial armor had absorbed the majority of the blast. Status? Jim demanded, checking each of his men for injuries. System still operational, Thompson reported. Brian reported, already realigning his sight on the technical. Minor damage to the right side optics. We can't stay here, Jim decided. We're too exposed to infantry assault. We need to reposition while maintaining engagement with the primary target. He returned to the driver's formation, starting the T-72's engine and engaging the transmission. The tank lurched forward, emerging from behind the protective rock formation and beginning to traverse the ridgeline. This movement gave them a better angle on the convoy below while making them a more difficult target for the RPG teams. Thompson, engaged that technical one more time, Jim ordered as he maneuvered. Mendez, switched to the commander's machine gun for better coverage against the infantry. The T-72 commander's position featured a 12.7mm heavy machine gun mounted on the turret roof, controllable from inside the tank through a sophisticated periscope system. It offered greater firepower against infantry than the coaxial gun, though using it effectively in the unfamiliar Soviet tank would be challenging. Thompson fired again, this time scoring a direct hit on the technical. The escort vehicle erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that illuminated the chaotic scene below. Path to primary target clear, Thompson confirmed. Load armor piercing and engage the missile launcher, Jim commanded, continuing to maneuver the tank along the ridgeline to complicate the infantry's targeting. The autoloader cycled, loading one of the T-72's powerful armor-piercing rounds. Thompson adjusted his aim, centering the sight on the missile launcher, which was now attempting to reverse course and escape back the way it had come. Firing, he announced. The round streaked toward the target, striking the missile launcher near its forward section. A bright flash indicated a hit, but the vehicle continued moving, though with visibly reduced speed. Partial effect, Thompson reported. Target damaged, but still operational. Hit it again, Jim ordered, bringing the tank to a position that offered both a clear firing angle and some protection from the infantry's RPGs. Another armor-piercing round was loaded, and Thompson took careful aim at the damaged missile launcher. This time, his shot struck the vehicle's propulsion system, causing a more significant explosion that immobilized it on the road. Target immobilized, Thompson confirmed, but their victory was short-lived. The missile launcher, though unable to move, began elevating its launch tube, preparing to fire its deadly payload despite the damage. They're going to launch, Jim realized with horror. They must have a preset target already programmed. Thompson, one more round, aim for the launch mechanism. The young soldier adjusted his aim, focusing on the elevating missile tube rather than the vehicle itself. It was a precise shot that would test the limits of both the T-72's accuracy and Thompson's skill. Steady, Jim coached him. Take your time. Control your breathing. Thompson fired, the round leaving the barrel with its characteristic thunderclap. Through his periscope, Jim watched as the armor-piercing projectile struck precisely at the base of the missile tube, severing it from its mounting. The launcher collapsed, the missile falling uselessly onto the vehicle's deck. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a catastrophic secondary explosion tore through the launcher as its fuel and warhead detonated, sending a massive fireball into the night sky. The force of the explosion rocked even their tank, positioned hundreds of meters away on the ridgeline. Target destroyed, Thompson announced, a note of awe in his voice. The remaining cartel vehicles were now fleeing in all directions, abandoning the burning wreckage of the convoy. The infantry that had been attempting to flank their position likewise began retreating, recognizing that their primary objective had been lost. Jim allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before addressing the next challenge. They had neutralized the immediate threat, but they were still deep in hostile territory, operating a Soviet tank with limited ammunition and without communication with friendly forces. "Good work, all of you," he said to his crew, "but we're not out of this yet. We need to link up with our forces and report what we've discovered." "How do we find them, sir?" Mendez asked. "We still can't raise them on the radio." Jim considered their options. The main battle was to the south. If they've neutralized the T-72s there, they'll likely establish a forward command post and begin search operations for missing personnel, including us. "So we head south?" Thompson asked. "Not directly," Jim decided. "We're in a Soviet tank, remember? If we approach an American position in this, we're likely to be engaged before we can identify ourselves. We need to find a way to signal our status." Donovan suggested, "We could abandon the T-72 at a safe distance and proceed on foot. That leaves us vulnerable to the remaining cartel forces," Jim countered, "and we lose our mobility and firepower. No, we need to keep the tank for now, but find a way to mark it as friendly." After considering their limited options, Jim formulated a plan. "We'll create an improvised American flag using the emergency marker panels from our survival kits. We'll secure it to the antenna so it's clearly visible. Additionally, we'll maintain a specific movement pattern, stopping every 100 meters and flashing our searchlight 3 times, a recognized distress signal." The crew set about implementing this plan, attaching the bright orange marker panels to the T-72's radio antenna in a pattern that roughly approximated an American flag. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough to give friendly forces pause before firing. With their makeshift identification in place, they began moving south toward where they expected to find the American force. Jim maintained a deliberate pace, balancing the need for speed against the risk of being misidentified by their own side. After traveling for approximately 2 miles, Thompson spotted movement ahead. "Vehicles approaching from the south, sir. American Humvees, 3 of them." Jim immediately halted the tank and activated the searchlight, flashing it 3 times as planned. The Humvees stopped as well, maintaining their distance as they assessed the unusual sight of a T-72 with an improvised American flag. "Hold position and keep your hands visible if we need to exit," Jim instructed his crew. "Let them approach us." After several tense minutes, a voice came over a loudspeaker from one of the Humvees. "Identify yourselves immediately." Jim opened the commander's hatch and stood up, hands clearly visible. "Captain James Blackwood, U.S. Army," he called out, "with Sergeants Donovan and Mendez and Private Thompson. We commandeered this vehicle after our Abrams was disabled." There was a pause. Then the lead Humvee advanced cautiously. As it drew closer, Jim recognized the figure standing in the top hatch. Lieutenant Colonel Parker, looking simultaneously relieved and confused. "Blackwood?" Parker called out incredulously. "What in God's name are you doing in a Soviet tank?" "Completing the mission, sir," Jim replied simply. "We've neutralized a Soviet tactical missile system that was being transported north under cartel protection. Request immediate secure communication with Colonel Harrison." Parker's expression shifted from confusion to alarm at the mention of a missile system. He ordered his driver to approach closer, then lowered his voice to avoid being overheard by his entire team. "You're certain it was a missile system, not just a launcher vehicle?" "Positive identification of an SS-21 Scarab tactical ballistic missile system, sir. We destroyed it before it could launch, but its presence suggests Soviet involvement beyond mere arms sales to cartels." Parker nodded gravely. The political officer suddenly confronted with an escalation far beyond the border security operation he had envisioned. "This complicates matters. Follow us back to the command post. Harrison will want your full report immediately." The journey back to the American position was tense but uneventful. Jim and his crew remained in the captured T-72, following the Humvees at a distance that made the American forces comfortable. As they traveled, Jim noticed that the battlefield had largely quieted, suggesting that the engagement with the remaining T-72s had been resolved. Upon reaching the command post, a collection of vehicles and temporary structures established in a defensible position, they were met by Colonel Harrison himself. The older officer's eyebrows rose dramatically at the sight of the Soviet tank with American markings, but his expression quickly shifted to one of professional interest. "I see you've brought us a souvenir, Blackwood," Harrison remarked as Jim and his crew dismounted from the T-72. "And from Parker's expression, I gather you found something significant." "Yes, sir," Jim confirmed, quickly briefing Harrison on their discovery and destruction of the missile system. He also handed over the documents they had recovered from the tank commander's position, which might provide valuable intelligence about the operation's true nature. Harrison listened intently, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. When Jim finished, the colonel was silent for a long moment, considering the implications. "This goes well beyond a cartel acquiring some tanks," he finally said. "A tactical missile system on American soil represents a major escalation and a clear national security threat. The question is whether this was a rogue operation by Volkov and a few Soviet military personnel, or something sanctioned at a higher level." "The SS-21 is a restricted system, sir," Jim pointed out. "It's not something that could be acquired without significant official involvement." Harrison nodded. "Agreed, Vijayan, which makes this an extremely sensitive situation diplomatically." He turned to Parker. "I need secure communication with Washington immediately. This goes all the way to the president." As Parker hurried to establish the necessary communications, Harrison turned back to Jim and his crew. "You men have performed extraordinarily under the most challenging circumstances. The capture of an intact T-72 alone would be considered a significant intelligence coup. The identification and neutralization of the missile system potentially saved countless American lives." "Thank you, sir," Jim responded, speaking for his exhausted crew. "Any word on the rest of our force?" Harrison's expression darkened. "We lost 2 Abrams and their crews. The remaining T-72s were destroyed, but at significant cost. The cartel forces that weren't directly engaged with our tanks have largely withdrawn across the border." The news of the lost tanks hit Jim hard. He had trained alongside those crews, known them as colleagues and friends. Their deaths added a somber weight to what might otherwise have been a moment of triumph. "What happens now, sir?" Jim asked after a respectful pause. Harrison sighed, showing a rare glimpse of the burden of command. "Now comes the complicated part. The diplomatic and intelligence communities will take over, working to determine the full extent of Soviet involvement and how to respond without triggering a broader confrontation." He gestured to the captured T-72. "That tank and the documents you recovered will be transported to a secure facility for comprehensive analysis. As for you and your men, you'll be debriefed extensively, then returned to your regular duties with commendations that, unfortunately, will likely remain classified for decades." "And the public?" Jim asked. "Will they ever know what happened here?" "Not for a very long time, if ever," Harrison replied frankly. "The presence of Soviet strategic weapons on American soil would cause panic if known, and acknowledging it publicly would force a diplomatic response that could escalate tensions globally. This will become one of those operations that shapes history without ever appearing in its pages." Jim understood the necessity, but couldn't help feeling a sense of injustice for the men who had given their lives. They would be honored in private ceremonies, their sacrifices known only to their immediate families and comrades. "Get some rest," Harrison advised, noting the exhaustion evident in all their faces. "You've earned it. Debriefing will begin at 0800 tomorrow." As the men dispersed to find food and temporary quarters, Jim remained behind, his gaze drawn to the T-72 they had captured and used to complete their mission. The Soviet tank looked out of place among the American vehicles, a physical embodiment of the shadowy conflict they had just experienced. A conflict fought not on the expected battlefields of Europe, but in the desert borderlands of their own country. Harrison followed his gaze. "Thinking about Volkov?" he asked perceptively. Jim nodded. "We disabled his tank, but I never saw confirmation that he was neutralized. A commander like that doesn't go down easily." "Intelligence is still processing the battlefield," Harrison said. "But preliminary reports suggest several T-72 crew members escaped, potentially including Volkov. If he survived, he's likely already across the border." The thought of Volkov escaping troubled Jim, not just because he represented an ongoing threat, but because their confrontation felt unfinished, a duel between professionals that had been interrupted rather than concluded. "If he's alive, we haven't seen the last of him," Jim predicted. Harrison placed a hand on Jim's shoulder. "Perhaps not, but that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, take pride in what you and your men accomplished. Whatever happens next, you've proven why I brought you here in the first place." With that, the colonel departed, leaving Jim alone with his thoughts. He looked up at the star-filled Texas sky, thinking of his daughter Sarah and the promise he had made to return to her. He had kept that promise, though the cost had been high for others. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of the command post operating through the night, radios crackling with updates, vehicles moving, orders being issued. the machinery of military response continuing its relentless rhythm. But beneath that familiar soundtrack, Jim sensed something new and troubling, the opening notes of a conflict that defied traditional boundaries and rules, one that might never be acknowledged in official histories but would shape the world nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring debriefings, reports, and eventually a return to the regular duties of an Army officer. But tonight, standing in the shadow of a Soviet tank on American soil, Captain James Blackwood knew that something fundamental had changed. For him, for his country, and perhaps for the world. Fort Hood, Texas Veterans Reunion, 20 London. Colonel James Iron Jim Blackwood paused in his narrative, his eyes distant with memories as the assembled veterans waited in rapt silence. The banquet hall that had earlier buzzed with conversation was now utterly still, each person present caught up in the story of a battle they had never known occurred. "What happened to the missile launcher?" someone finally asked, breaking the spell. Jim's weathered face creased in a grim smile. Officially, there was no missile launcher, no T-72s on American soil, no battle in Eagle Valley. According to the public record, we were conducting routine training exercises that spring. And unofficially? Pressed the young captain who had been skeptical at the beginning of Jim's story. Unofficially, Jim replied, his voice dropping slightly. The destruction of that SS-21 launcher altered the course of a covert operation designed to fundamentally change the balance of power in the Cold War. Had that missile been launched at its intended target, which we later learned was a strategic air command base in Texas, the resulting crisis could have escalated in unpredictable ways. He looked around at the faces of the younger veterans, men and women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, conflicts with their own complexities, but of a fundamentally different nature than the shadowy confrontation he had described. The Cold War wasn't just fought in Berlin or proxy conflicts in distant countries, Jim continued. Sometimes it came right to our doorstep, fought by men whose names never appeared in newspapers or history books, whose medals were presented in closed ceremonies and then locked away in classified files. "What about Volkov?" asked another veteran. "Did you ever find out what happened to him?" A curious expression crossed Jim's face, part respect, part unresolved tension. "That," he said with deliberate emphasis, "is a story for another time." As the gathering broke into smaller conversations, discussing what they had heard and its implications, Jim fingered the twisted piece of metal in his pocket, a fragment of Soviet armor that had nearly taken his life that night in 1986. It was his personal reminder of a truth that few would ever know, that sometimes history's most consequential battles leave no trace in its official record, preserved only in the memories of those who fought them and the silent pieces of metal they carry as talismans of what might have been. The medal he had received for that night's actions remained in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon. The men he had lost were honored only in the hearts of those who had known them. But as he looked around at the young soldiers listening to his story, Jim felt a sense of continuation, of passing something important to a new generation who might one day face their own unrecorded battles. Some wars are fought in the full light of public attention, documented by journalists and studied by historians. Others remain in shadow, known only to those who experience them firsthand. But both shape the world we inherit, and both demand the same courage, sacrifice, and dedication from those who answer their country's call. For Captain James Iron Jim Blackwood, that call had come on a spring night in 1986, in a battle that officially never happened, and he had answered it the only way he knew how, with every ounce of skill, determination, and leadership he possessed. That, more than any medal or public recognition, was the legacy he hoped to pass on to the next generation of American soldiers. The interrogation room was Spartan, containing only a metal table and the two chairs. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the men seated across from each other. Captain James Blackwood sat with his back straight, his uniform pressed despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. Across from him, a man in a dark suit leaned forward, his government credentials displayed on the table between them. "Let's go through it one more time, Captain," the man said, his voice neutral but insistent. "You're certain the vehicle you destroyed was an SS-21 Scarab missile system?" Jim met the man's gaze without wavering. "Yes, sir, I'm familiar with Soviet weapon systems. It was definitely an SS-21 prepared to launch." The CIA officer, he had introduced himself only as Reynolds, made a notation in his file. This was the fourth such interrogation Jim had endured over the past 3 days, each with a different agency representative. each covering the same ground with slightly different emphasis. And Colonel Volkov, Reynolds continued, you believe he survived the engagement? His tank was disabled, not destroyed, Jim replied. No body was recovered. Given his reputation and training, I believe he would have had contingency plans for extraction. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. That aligns with our intelligence. We have indications that several individuals matching the description of Soviet military personnel crossed back into Mexico within hours of the engagement. Jim felt a mixture of vindication and concern. Volkov alive meant unfinished business, a threat that could reemerge at any moment. What happens now? Jim asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Reynolds closed his file deliberately. Now, Captain, this incident never happened. You were participating in routine training exercises. The damage to your tank resulted from mechanical failure. The loss of the other Abrams tanks will be attributed to similar malfunctions during high-intensity training. And the men who died? Jim asked, unable to keep a note of anger from his voice. They will be honored appropriately, Reynolds assured him, his tone softening slightly. Their families will know they died serving their country, though the specific circumstances will remain classified. Jim had expected this response, but hearing it formalized still left a bitter taste. What about Volkov and the Soviet involvement? Are we just going to pretend it never happened? That's being handled through diplomatic channels, Captain. Very quiet, very delicate diplomatic channels. Reynolds leaned forward. The presence of Soviet strategic weapon systems on American soil represents an escalation that neither side can publicly acknowledge without risking a much broader confrontation. So they get away with it, Jim concluded flatly. Reynolds shook his head. Not exactly. Let's just say that certain Soviet officials are receiving very direct messages about the consequences of any similar attempts in the future. But those conversations won't appear in any newspaper. The CIA man gathered his materials and stood. Your crew has already been debriefed and reassigned. You'll be receiving new orders tomorrow. I understand Colonel Harrison has requested you for a special assignment. Jim nodded, not surprised that Harrison had intervened. The colonel had always looked out for him, recognizing value in Jim's unorthodox approaches where others saw only insubordination. One last thing, Captain, Reynolds said at the door. Excellent work out there. Not many men could have done what you did. Even fewer would have had the initiative to commandeer an enemy tank to complete the mission. A ghost of a smile crossed his otherwise impassive face. The intelligence boys are having a field day with that T-72 you brought back. The technical data alone is worth its weight in gold. With that, Reynolds left, leaving Jim alone with his thoughts. For 3 days, he had recounted every detail of the engagement, explaining his decisions, justifying his actions, reliving the moments when American soldiers had died fighting a battle their country would never officially acknowledge. A knock at the door preceded Colonel Harrison's entrance. The older officer looked tired but satisfied, carrying a folder under his arm. All done, Blackwood? He asked, taking the seat Reynolds had vacated. Yes, sir, though I imagine there will be more debriefs in my future. Harrison chuckled without humor. Count on it. This kind of operation generates paperwork for years. He placed the folder on the table. Your new orders. I've pulled some strings to keep you with the Abrams program, despite some recommendations that you be transferred to a less sensitive position. Jim raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Lieutenant Colonel Parker suggested I might be a security risk? Parker is doing what bureaucrats do best, covering his ass. He recommended you for a medal in the same breath that he suggested you might have been compromised by your exposure to Soviet equipment. Harrison shook his head in disgust. Fortunately, I still outrank him. Jim opened the folder, scanning the orders within. He was being assigned to the armor school at Fort Knox as an instructor, specifically teaching advanced tactics for the M1 Abrams. It was a prestigious posting that would keep him involved with the tank program while removing him from the politically sensitive border region. Thank you, sir, Jim said sincerely. This is better than I expected. You earned it. Harrison's weathered face grew serious. There's something else you should know, something not in those orders. Jim waited, sensing the weight of what was to come. Volkov is definitely alive, Harrison continued. Intelligence tracked him to Mexico City, then lost him. But before he disappeared, he was observed meeting with Cuban intelligence officers. The implications were clear. He's still active, still working against us. Harrison nodded grimly. The game continues, Blackwood. The Cold War doesn't pause for near misses or close calls. If anything, what happened here has only raised the stakes. Jim absorbed this information, feeling a curious mixture of dread and anticipation. Somehow he had known his path would cross with Volkov's again. The Soviet commander was too determined, too professional to simply fade away after such a significant operation. What about my crew? Jim asked, shifting focus to a more immediate concern. All receiving commendations. Though like yours, they'll remain classified. Thompson is being fast-tracked for officer candidate school. That young man has a bright future. Donovan is transferring to the new Abrams training program at Fort Hood. And Mendez, Harrison paused. Mendez requested reassignment to Army intelligence. Seems your adventure gave him a taste for the more clandestine side of warfare. Jim smiled, proud of his men and their trajectories. They had faced an extraordinary situation and performed beyond all expectations. Whatever came next for them, they had proven themselves under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. When do I report to Knox? Jim asked, closing the folder. 2 weeks. I figured you could use some leave first. Harrison studied him with paternal concern. Go see your daughter, Blackwood. Spend some time remembering what we're fighting to protect. It helps, believe me. Jim nodded, grateful for the older officer's understanding. I will, sir. Thank you. As Harrison rose to leave, he hesitated, then spoke with uncharacteristic emotion. What you and your men did out there, stopping that missile, bringing back that Soviet tank, it may never appear in any history book, but it mattered. Don't ever forget that. Jim stood and saluted, a gesture of respect beyond mere military protocol. No, sir, I won't. After Harrison departed, Jim remained in the interrogation room for a few minutes, processing everything that had happened. The battle in Eagle Valley felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The faces of the men who hadn't returned haunted him, their sacrifices rendered invisible by the necessities of national security and global politics. Yet there was also pride in his crew, in their accomplishment, in the knowledge that their actions had potentially prevented a catastrophic escalation. It was a complex emotional landscape that Jim suspected he would be navigating for years to come. With a deep breath, he gathered the folder containing his new orders and left the room. It was time to go home, time to see Sarah, time to reconnect with the world beyond the classified bubble he had inhabited for the past several days. As he walked through the corridors of this secure facility, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Volkov remained unfinished. Something told him that their paths would cross again, that the chess game between them had merely reached a pause, not a conclusion. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, he felt a curious readiness, a professional soldier's acceptance of future challenges not yet defined. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination and adaptability that had seen him through the Valley of Death. Washington, D.C., 1 month later. The Pentagon briefing room hummed with tense energy as senior military and intelligence officials gathered around the large conference table. Maps of Central America dominated the wall screens, with particular emphasis on Nicaragua and Honduras. Jim sat uncomfortably in his dress uniform, feeling out of place among the generals and agency directors. His presence had been specifically requested by the Secretary of Defense, a fact that had raised eyebrows among the regular attendees of such high-level briefings. Gentlemen, began the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, bringing the room to order, I believe you're all familiar with the situation in Nicaragua. The Sandinista government continues to receive substantial military support from Cuba and, by extension, the Soviet Union. What's new is the nature of that support. He nodded to a CIA officer who activated one of the screens, displaying satellite imagery of what appeared to be a military installation under construction. 3 weeks ago, our surveillance detected unusual activity at this location, approximately 30 miles east of Managua. Initial assessment suggested standard military construction, barracks, vehicle depots, the usual. However, subsequent passes revealed features consistent with missile launch facilities. Jim leaned forward, his attention sharpening. The layout was familiar from his military intelligence briefings, characteristic of Soviet tactical missile deployments. We now believe this is being prepared as a forward operating base for SS-21 Scarab tactical ballistic missiles, the CIA officer continued, similar to those deployed in Eastern Europe, but with one critical difference. These would be within striking distance of U.S. military installations in Honduras and Panama. The Secretary of Defense spoke next, his voice grave. If these missiles become operational, they would represent a significant escalation in the region and a direct threat to our forces. The President has made it clear that this is unacceptable. What's the diplomatic approach? Asked one of the generals. Ongoing but complicated, replied a State Department representative. The Nicaraguan government denies any knowledge of missile deployments. The Soviets claim they're merely providing defensive capabilities to a sovereign nation. The usual dance. The Secretary of Defense turned his attention to Jim. Captain Blackwood, your experience with Soviet tactical missile systems, particularly the SS-21, is why you're here. We need your assessment of this situation based on what you encountered in Texas. Jim felt the weight of all eyes in the room. Carefully, he studied the satellite imagery, noting the similarities and differences to what he had seen in Eagle Valley. The construction pattern is consistent with SS-21 deployment, he confirmed. But this is far more extensive, not just a single launcher, but infrastructure for a sustained presence. Multiple launchers, reload capabilities, maintenance facilities. Your professional opinion, Captain, pressed the secretary. Is this the work of the same Soviet officer you encountered, this Colonel Volkov? Jim considered the question thoughtfully. It's possible, sir. The operational security is similar, the way they've disguised key elements of the installation as civilian infrastructure. But this is larger, more ambitious. If Volkov is involved, he's been given substantially more resources than before. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs nodded. That aligns with our intelligence. We believe Volkov has been promoted to lead a special operations group within the GRU, specifically focused on forward deployment of tactical nuclear-capable systems. The mention of nuclear capabilities sent a chill through the room. The SS-21 could carry conventional warheads, but its primary design purpose was tactical nuclear delivery. So what are our options? Asked another general. We can't allow nuclear-capable missiles 90 miles from U.S. bases. The President has authorized a range of contingencies, the Secretary of Defense replied. Everything from diplomatic pressure to covert action to direct military intervention if necessary. What we lack is precise intelligence on the current state of the deployment. Satellite imagery only tells us so much. He turned to Jim again. Captain, you're being temporarily assigned to a joint task force under CIA operational control. Your mission is to enter Nicaragua covertly with a small team and gather actionable intelligence on this missile deployment. Specifically, we need to know if nuclear warheads are present, how many launchers are operational, and the command structure controlling them. Jim absorbed this information, understanding the enormous responsibility being placed on his shoulders. This wasn't a tank battle on the border. This was covert entry into a hostile nation, gathering intelligence on what could become the flashpoint for a major international crisis. When do I leave, sir? He asked simply. Immediately, the secretary replied. Your team has already been assembled, specialists with relevant experience. You'll be briefed on the operational details en route to your staging area in Honduras. As the meeting concluded, the CIA officer who had presented the satellite imagery approached Jim privately. Captain, he said quietly, there's something else you should know. Intelligence suggests Volkov personally visits the site weekly to oversee progress. There's a high probability you'll encounter him during your mission. Jim nodded, unsurprised. Somehow he had been expecting this since the moment he was summoned to Washington. The unfinished business between him and the Soviet colonel had been postponed, not abandoned. Thank you for the information, Jim replied evenly. The CIA officer studied him curiously. Most men would be concerned about facing an adversary who nearly killed them once before. Jim offered a tight smile. Colonel Volkov is a professional, so am I. We each have our missions to complete. The personal element is irrelevant. It wasn't entirely true, but it was the appropriate response for a military officer accepting a difficult assignment. The reality was more complex. Jim felt a curious anticipation at the prospect of matching wits with Volkov again, this time on the Soviet officer's territory. As Jim left the Pentagon to prepare for his deployment, his thoughts turned briefly to Sarah. He had enjoyed his short leave with her, treasuring the normalcy of father-daughter time after the surreal events in Texas. Now he was heading into danger again, unable to tell her where he was going or when he would return. It was the burden of his profession, the price of serving in the shadowy realms where the Cold War was actually fought. Not in public statements or propaganda, but in secret confrontations that would never make headlines. Aboard a C-130 transport aircraft 2 days later, the C-130 Hercules rumbled through the night sky, its 4 propellant engines maintaining a constant drone that made conversation difficult without headsets. Jim sat with his 4-man team in the dimly lit cargo hold, reviewing the operational details one final time before their insertion. Master Sergeant William Ghost Harris was their communications and electronics specialist, a veteran of special operations with an uncanny ability to disappear in plain sight. Staff Sergeant Marcus Torres brought expertise in Soviet military systems, having defected from Cuban intelligence 3 years earlier. Sergeant First Class Daniel Reynolds was their medic and demolitions expert, a dual specialization that Jim found ironically appropriate, and Technical Sergeant Paul Mitchell rounded out the team as their air-ground coordination specialist, vital for their extraction plan. "Final equipment check," Jim ordered over the intercom. "We insert in 30 minutes." The men methodically inspected their gear. Modified civilian clothing that would blend in Nicaragua, concealed sidearms, communications equipment disguised as commercial electronics, and the specialized reconnaissance tools they would need to assess the missile installation. "Remember," Jim emphasized, "this is intelligence gathering only. We observe, we document, we extract. No engagement unless absolutely necessary for survival." The men nodded in understanding. They were an experienced team, selected for this mission because of their specific skills and their ability to operate with minimal supervision in hostile territory. "Ghost," Jim continued, addressing Harris, "you have primary responsibility for communication security. The Nicaraguan military has Soviet signal intelligence equipment. Assume all transmissions are monitored." "Roger that, Captain," Harris replied. "We'll use the burst transmission protocol. Compress and send only at the designated windows." Jim turned to Torres. "You're our eyes for Soviet procedures. I need you to identify not just what they have, but how far along they are in the deployment process." Torres nodded grimly. "The SS-21 has a specific operational readiness sequence. I know what to look for." "Reynolds, Mitchell, you're our insurance policy. If things go sideways, we may need both medical support and an alternative extraction. Be ready for either contingency." Both men acknowledged the order with professional nods. They had trained for high-risk insertions, understood the dangers, and accepted the responsibilities that came with such missions. The aircraft's loadmaster approached, signaling that they were 10 minutes from the drop zone. Jim and his team made final adjustments to their parachute harnesses, preparing for the Halo high-altitude, low-opening jump that would insert them covertly into Nicaraguan territory. "One last thing," Jim said to his team as they moved toward the rear ramp. "If you encounter a Soviet officer matching Colonel Volkov's description, do not, I repeat, do not engage him directly. Report immediately and maintain surveillance only. Is that clear?" The men confirmed their understanding, though Jim caught a questioning look from Harris. The master sergeant knew enough about Jim's history with Volkov to wonder about the specific instruction. As the rear ramp lowered, exposing the team to the rushing wind and the darkness beyond, Jim put aside all thoughts except the mission. The political complexities, the personal history, the potential global implications, all receded before the immediate requirements of a dangerous infiltration into hostile territory. One by one, they leapt into the night, falling through the cloud layer into the invisible landscape below, their black parachutes opening only at the last safe moment to minimize the risk of detection. Nicaraguan jungle, 50 miles east of Managua. The heat was oppressive, a thick, humid blanket that clung to the skin and sapped energy with every movement. Jim and his team had been moving stealthily through the dense jungle for 2 days, avoiding the Sandinista patrols that regularly swept the area around the construction site. They had established an observation post on a ridgeline overlooking the facility, concealed by the thick vegetation but offering a clear view of the activities below. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. "That's definitely an SS-21 transporter erector launcher," Torres whispered, peering through high-powered binoculars. "And there, that bunker structure is typical Soviet design for warhead storage." Jim studied the facility through his own binoculars, noting the security arrangements, the movement patterns of personnel, and the progress of the construction. The site was further advanced than the satellite imagery had suggested, with at least 2 launcher positions already completed and a third under construction. "Mitchell," Jim said quietly, "I need detailed photographs of those launchers, especially the service markings. Get as close as you safely can after dark." Mitchell nodded, already preparing the specialized camera equipment designed for low-light conditions. His mission would be the most dangerous yet, approaching the perimeter of the facility to gather detailed visual intelligence. "Ghost, establish the secure uplink," Jim continued. "We need to transmit what we found so far. The Pentagon needs to know they're further along than expected." Harris set up the compact satellite communication system, disguised to resemble standard geological survey equipment. The system would compress their intelligence into a brief, encrypted burst transmission that would be difficult for Nicaraguan signal intelligence to detect or interpret. As night fell, Mitchell departed on his photography mission while the rest of the team maintained their observation post. Jim took the first watch, scanning the facility through night vision equipment as Harris encoded their initial findings for transmission. "Captain," Torres said, joining Jim at the observation point, "there's something not right about this facility." "Explain," Jim prompted, respecting the former Cuban intelligence officer's instincts. "The security pattern is odd, very compartmentalized. See how those guards never cross into each other's sectors? How the technicians working on the launchers are kept separate from the ones at the storage bunkers? That's excessive security, even for a missile deployment." Jim had noticed the same anomaly, but welcomed the confirmation from someone with direct experience of Soviet military procedures. "Your assessment?" Torres frowned, considering. "Either they're extremely paranoid about operational security or they're handling something that requires special protocols," Jim finished, "like nuclear warheads." The possibility hung in the air between them, its implications too serious to dismiss. If the Soviets were indeed deploying nuclear-capable missiles with actual nuclear warheads to Nicaragua, it represented an escalation beyond anything seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. "We need confirmation," Jim decided. "When Mitchell returns with the photographs, we'll plan a closer look at that storage bunker. The Pentagon needs to know with absolute certainty what we're dealing with." Torres nodded in agreement, though his expression revealed concern about the increased risk such close reconnaissance would entail. Hours later, Mitchell returned, his mission successful. The photographs he had taken revealed critical details about the launchers: Soviet military markings, specific modifications, and signs of recent transport from Eastern Europe rather than the Soviet Union directly. "This isn't just a training deployment," Torres concluded after examining the images. "These are operational strategic systems, the same ones they've positioned to threaten Western Europe, now pointed at U.S. installations in Central America." Jim incorporated this intelligence into their update for transmission. As Harris prepared the burst communication, a sudden movement at the facility below caught Jim's attention. A convoy of vehicles was arriving, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the main administration building. The lead vehicle was a UAZ-469, a Soviet military jeep typically used by senior officers. The small convoy moved with precision, suggesting a practiced routine rather than an unexpected visit. "Ghost, hold the transmission," Jim ordered. "We have new developments." Through his night vision device, Jim observed as the vehicles parked and their occupants disembarked. The man who emerged from the UAZ stood out immediately, tall, with the distinctive bearing of senior military leadership. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about his movements, the way he surveyed the facility with measured scrutiny. "Torres," Jim said, passing the night vision device. "Is that who I think it is?" Torres observed for several seconds, then nodded grimly. "Colonel Volkov, or should I say General Volkov now, judging by the deference being shown to him." Jim felt a curious tightening in his chest, not fear, but the alertness of a professional recognizing a worthy adversary. Volkov had indeed survived their encounter in Texas and, as intelligence had suggested, been promoted rather than punished for the failure of that operation. "This changes our approach," Jim decided. "Volkov's presence confirms the strategic importance of this facility. We need to get closer, understand exactly what he's supervising." The team spent the remainder of the night observing the activity centered around Volkov's arrival. The Soviet officer conducted what appeared to be an inspection tour of the facility, focusing particularly on the storage bunkers that Torres had identified as potential warhead repositories. By dawn, Volkov and his entourage had departed, but Jim had made his decision. "Tonight, we get closer. I need to know what's in those bunkers, and I need to understand Volkov's role in all this." The team spent the day planning their approach, studying the patrol patterns, identifying blind spots in the security perimeter, and preparing the specialized equipment they would need. It would be a high-risk operation, bringing them within the outer security zone of the facility. As darkness fell once more, Jim and Torres prepared for their infiltration, while Harris and Reynolds maintained the observation post and Mitchell established a secondary position to cover their extraction route. "Remember," Jim instructed Torres as they applied camouflage paint to their faces, "we document only. No engagement, no matter what we find." Torres nodded, his expression serious. What if we encounter Volkov? We don't, Jim said firmly. He left this morning. But if by some chance he returns and we're compromised, your priority is to get the intelligence out. I'll handle Volkov. The jungle night enveloped them as they began their careful approach to the facility. Moving silently through the undergrowth, they avoided the regular patrols by tracking the guards' movements and timing their advances accordingly. Reaching the outer perimeter fence, they used specialized cutting tools to create an opening just large enough to slip through. Once inside, they faced the most dangerous part of their mission, crossing the open ground between the perimeter and the storage bunkers. Using the shadows cast by the security lighting, they advanced in short bursts, freezing into immobility whenever guards approached. It was painstaking progress, each movement calculated, each pause extending into minutes of complete stillness. Finally, they reached the first storage bunker. The entrance was secured with both conventional locks and what appeared to be an electronic security system. Torres examined it carefully, then gestured to a ventilation duct on the side of the structure. That's our way in, he whispered. Standard Soviet design flaw. The ducts are secured against entry, but the security focuses on preventing someone from removing the grate entirely. The grates themselves have gaps large enough for fiber optic cameras. Jim nodded, impressed with Torres's detailed knowledge. They moved to the ventilation duct, and Torres extracted a specialized fiber optic scope from his equipment pouch. The thin, flexible camera could be threaded through the grate, allowing them to view the interior without entering. Carefully, Torres inserted the scope and began a methodical survey of the bunker's contents. Jim watched his expression, noting the moment when the former Cuban officer's eyes widened in recognition. Nuclear warheads, Torres confirmed, his voice barely audible. At least 6 that I can see. Tactical yield, consistent with the SS-21 platform. Jim felt the weight of this confirmation settle over him. They had just verified the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons in Nicaragua, less than 1,000 miles from the continental United States. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, conducted this time with greater secrecy and potentially greater consequence. We need to document this conclusively, Jim decided. Can you get the camera deeper in? I need images of the warhead serial numbers if possible. Torres nodded, extending the fiber optic scope further into the ventilation system. As he maneuvered the camera for better angles, a sudden noise from nearby froze them both in place. Voices approached, speaking Russian rather than Spanish. Jim and Torres pressed themselves against the bunker wall, becoming one with the shadows as a small group of Soviet technicians rounded the corner, engaged in intense discussion. Through his limited Russian language training, Jim could understand fragments of their conversation, something about activation protocols and readiness status. The technicians passed within feet of their position, completely unaware of the American observers documenting their secret deployment. As the technicians entered the bunker using an electronic key card, Jim and Torres remained motionless, barely breathing. The open door briefly revealed the interior that Torres had been viewing through the fiber optic scope. Specialized storage containers arranged in precise rows, each bearing the unmistakable nuclear hazard symbol. When the technicians finally departed, locking the bunker behind them, Jim signaled that it was time to withdraw. They had the confirmation they needed, more than enough to justify immediate action by Washington. Their retreat was as carefully executed as their approach, each movement planned, each potential encounter anticipated and avoided. They were nearly back to the perimeter fence when disaster struck. A guard appeared unexpectedly, deviating from the patrol pattern they had so carefully observed. There was no time to hide, no shadow deep enough to conceal their presence. The guard spotted them, his eyes widening in shock before he reached for his weapon. Torres reacted first, lunging forward with trained precision to disable the guard before he could raise an alarm. The Cuban's hand clamped over the guard's mouth while his other arm locked around the man's throat in a textbook chokehold. Within seconds, the guard lost consciousness, slumping in Torres's grip. "Drag him into the bushes," Jim ordered quietly. "We need to move immediately. They'll notice he's missing when he fails to check in." They concealed the unconscious guard and accelerated their retreat, no longer able to move with the same methodical caution. Reaching the perimeter fence, they slipped through their prepared opening and disappeared into the jungle beyond, moving rapidly toward their rendezvous point with Mitchell. As they navigated through the dense vegetation, the facility behind them remained quiet. Either the guard's absence hadn't yet been noticed, or the response was being coordinated silently. Either way, Jim knew their window for extraction was closing rapidly. "Mitchell, this is Blackwood," Jim whispered into his encrypted radio once they were safely beyond immediate pursuit range. "Rally Point Alpha, prepare for emergency extraction." "Roger that," came Mitchell's calm reply. "Be advised, we have unexpected company at Rally Point Alpha. Suggest divert to secondary location." Jim's instincts flared. "Clarify unexpected company." There was a brief pause before Mitchell responded. "Soviet personnel. One appears to match Volkov's description. They arrived by helicopter approximately 20 minutes ago." Jim and Torres exchanged alarmed glances. Volkov's return was not just unexpected, it was potentially catastrophic for their mission. Had they been compromised? Was this a response to the discovery of the unconscious guard or something else entirely? "Understood," Jim replied. "Moving to Rally Point Bravo, alert Ghost and Reynolds to relocate immediately." As they changed course toward their secondary extraction point, Jim's mind raced through the implications. If Volkov was back at the facility so soon after his previous visit, something significant must have occurred. Perhaps new intelligence about potential American interest in the site, or acceleration of the deployment timeline. They moved swiftly through the jungle, Torres taking point with his superior knowledge of the terrain. The night was still around them, the only sounds their controlled breathing and the occasional distant call of nocturnal wildlife. They had covered perhaps half the distance to Rally Point Bravo when Torres suddenly froze, raising a closed fist in the universal signal to halt. Jim stopped instantly, listening for whatever had alerted his companion. The sound came again. A twig snapping somewhere to their right, followed by the subtle rustle of movement through undergrowth. Someone was paralleling their course, moving with considerable skill, but not quite silently enough in the dense jungle. Jim signaled Torres to continue forward while he covered their rear. The Cuban nodded in understanding and resumed movement, now even more carefully than before. Jim waited until Torres had advanced several meters, then began to follow, moving perpendicular to their original path to potentially intercept whoever was tracking them. The jungle was dark, the canopy blocking most of the moonlight, but Jim's night vision equipment allowed him to distinguish shapes and movement in the gloom. He positioned himself behind a large tree, waiting patiently as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. A figure emerged into a small clearing, moving with the deliberate precision of a trained tracker. Even before the moonlight revealed the man's face, Jim recognized the distinctive bearing of Colonel, now apparently General, Nikolai Volkov. The Soviet officer was alone, which surprised Jim. Either Volkov was supremely confident in his abilities, or he had support nearby that Jim hadn't detected. Neither option was particularly comforting. Jim remained motionless, controlling his breathing as Volkov paused in the clearing, studying the ground for signs of passage. The Soviet officer was dressed not in a uniform, but in practical field attire, carrying only a sidearm and what appeared to be a compact radio. For a moment, Jim considered his options. The mission parameters were clear: intelligence gathering only, no engagement unless necessary for survival. Confronting Volkov directly would compromise those parameters and potentially jeopardize the critical information they had gathered. Yet something told Jim that Volkov's presence here, alone in the jungle, tracking them personally rather than dispatching troops, suggested this encounter was inevitable, perhaps even intentional on the Soviets' part. Before Jim could decide on a course of action, Volkov straightened and spoke clearly into the darkness. "Captain Blackwood," he said in accented but precise English, "we both know you are there, and we both know what you have discovered tonight." Jim felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Volkov knew he was here specifically, not just that American forces had infiltrated the facility. The implications were disturbing. Either their mission had been compromised from the beginning, or Volkov possessed uncanny intuition about his adversary. "You have two choices," Volkov continued, turning slowly as he spoke, his eyes scanning the darkness. "You can attempt to complete your mission and deliver your intelligence, in which case I must try to stop you. Or we can speak, soldier to soldier, about what is really happening here." Jim remained silent, evaluating the situation. Volkov appeared to be alone, but that could be deception. The Soviet officer's body language showed confidence, but not the tension that would suggest an imminent ambush. Making his decision, Jim activated his throat microphone to transmit to Torres. "Continue to the rally point. If I'm not there in 30 minutes, extract without me. The intelligence must reach Washington." Torres acknowledged with a simple click, and Jim could hear his teammate resuming movement away from the confrontation. Whatever happened next, the mission would continue. Very well, General Volkov, Jim said, stepping partially into view, but maintaining a position of tactical advantage behind the tree. Let's talk, soldier to soldier. Volkov turned toward his voice, a smile of satisfaction crossing his face. You recognize the promotion. I'm flattered by your attention to detail, Captain. Last time we met, you were trying to kill me, Jim observed neutrally. Has that changed? Volkov spread his hands in a gesture of apparent openness. If I wanted you dead, Captain, I would not be here alone. I would have brought the considerable forces at my disposal. No, I am here to communicate, not to eliminate. Communicate what? Jim asked, maintaining his vigilance despite the Soviets' reasonable tone. Context, Volkov replied simply. You have seen the missiles. You have confirmed the warheads, but you do not understand their purpose. Enlighten me, Brigadier, Jim said, his voice edged with skepticism. Because from where I stand, nuclear-capable missiles aimed at American installations looks like a deliberate provocation. Another Cuba, but with even higher stakes. Volkov shook his head slowly. Not a provocation, Captain. A response. A carefully calibrated response to your country's deployment of Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, within minutes of Soviet cities. What you are witnessing is the logical progression of the strategic dialogue between our nations. Nuclear missiles in Nicaragua goes beyond dialogue, Jim countered. It's an escalation that risks direct confrontation. Is it? Volkov challenged. When your country places missiles in Turkey and Germany, it is defensive. When mine places similar systems in Nicaragua, it is aggressive. The double standard is striking. There was a certain logic to Volkov's argument, though Jim wasn't about to concede the point. The difference is transparency. Our deployments are acknowledged, conducted under NATO auspices with public knowledge. Yours are covert, denied, hidden behind puppet governments and false narratives. Volkov laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor. Transparency is a luxury of the powerful, Captain. The Soviet Union does what it must to maintain strategic parity with the United States. The methods may differ, but the objective is the same, stability through mutual deterrence. Is that what Texas was about? Jim asked sharply. Stability? Deterrence? You were preparing to launch a missile at an American military base from our own soil. A flash of something, regret, respect, crossed Volkov's face. Texas was an error in judgment. Not mine, but my superiors. Too aggressive, too provocative. This approach, he gestured to indicate the facility beyond the jungle, is more measured, more defensible in the global arena. Jim studied the Soviet officer, trying to discern his true purpose in this unusual conversation. Why are you telling me this? Why reveal your strategic thinking to the very person tasked with countering it? Volkov stepped closer, his expression intense. Because, Captain, you and I are but instruments in a larger symphony. We execute the notes written by others, fight the battles determined by strategists far removed from the consequences. Does it not strike you as absurd that we, who respect each other as professionals, must continually seek each other's destruction at the behest of politicians who will never face such dangers themselves? The question resonated uncomfortably with thoughts Jim had occasionally entertained, but pushed aside as irrelevant to his duty. The philosophical dimensions of the Cold War, the morality of mutual assured destruction, the abstract chess game played with millions of lives as pawns, were typically the province of academics and policymakers, not field officers. We serve our countries, Jim replied, the standard answer that had always sufficed before. Yet even as he spoke, he was conscious of its inadequacy in this moment, face to face with an enemy who was, in many ways, his mirror image. Yes, we do, Volkov agreed, surprising Jim with his concurrence. And we will continue to do so. I will complete my mission here overseeing this deployment. You will report what you have discovered to your superiors. Our respective governments will engage in their diplomatic dance, making threats and counter-threats, perhaps reaching some accommodation that allows both sides to claim victory while changing nothing fundamental. Then why this conversation, Jim pressed? What's the point? Volkov's expression became contemplative. Perhaps I wish for you to understand that I am not a mindless instrument, that I see the larger pattern as clearly as you do. Perhaps I respect you too much after our encounter in Texas to simply try to eliminate you without explanation. Or perhaps, he added with a hint of a smile, I am simply keeping you engaged while my forces move to surround your team's extraction point." The last statement sent a surge of adrenaline through Jim, though he maintained his outward composure. "That would be a tactical error, General. My men have contingencies for exactly such a scenario." "Of course they do," Volkov acknowledged, "as would mine. We are professionals, after all." A distant sound caught Jim's attention, the distinctive whop, whop, whop of helicopter rotors approaching. Volkov heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the sound. "It seems our conversation must end, Captain," he said, glancing at his watch. "Your extraction helicopter will be arriving at your secondary rally point in approximately 15 minutes. You should hurry if you wish to make your rendezvous." Jim's surprise must have shown on his face because Volkov smiled more broadly. "Yes, we know about your extraction plan. We have known about your mission from the beginning, yet you were allowed to gather your intelligence, to confirm the presence of our missiles and warheads." "Why?" Jim demanded. "Why allow us to document what you're doing here?" "Because it serves our purpose as well as yours," Volkov explained. "Your government now knows exactly what we have deployed. They know the strategic calculus has changed, and they will respond exactly as we anticipate, with diplomatic pressure, with counter-deployments, with threats that neither side intends to execute. The balance adjusts, the game continues, and direct confrontation is avoided through mutual understanding of the consequences." It was a coldly logical explanation, one that cast the entire mission in a different light. They hadn't succeeded through skill or stealth, but because their actions served the Soviet strategy as much as the American one. "This isn't over, Volkov," Jim said, beginning to back away toward the extraction point. "No, Captain Blackwood, it is not," the Soviet officer agreed. "Our paths will cross again, I have no doubt. Next time, perhaps the circumstances will be different." As Jim disappeared into the jungle, moving swiftly to rejoin his team, Volkov's voice followed him with a final observation. "We are more alike than different, you and I. Remember that when next we meet." The extraction proceeded without incident, the helicopter arriving exactly when and where expected. Jim and his team were lifted out of Nicaragua with their crucial intelligence intact, their mission technically a success despite the disturbing revelation of Soviet foreknowledge. During the flight back to their forward operating base in Honduras, Jim replayed his conversation with Volkov in his mind, troubled by the Soviet officer's perspective and the implications of his statements. The idea that they had been allowed to complete their mission as part of some larger Soviet strategy suggested a level of strategic thinking beyond what American intelligence had attributed to their adversaries. More personally disturbing was Volkov's assertion of their similarity, the notion that they were both simply instruments in a larger geopolitical game, professionals doing their duty without questioning the larger purpose. It struck uncomfortably close to thoughts Jim had occasionally entertained in his darker moments. Washington, D.C. 2 weeks later. "The President has been briefed on your findings," the Secretary of Defense informed Jim, closing the classified folder containing the mission report. "The National Security Council is meeting now to determine our response." They sat in the Secretary's Pentagon office, a space designed to project power and authority while maintaining the utmost security for sensitive discussions. Jim had spent the past 2 weeks debriefing intelligence analysts, military strategists, and State Department officials, recounting every detail of what they had observed at the Nicaraguan facility. "What's likely to happen?" Jim asked, knowing he was stretching protocol by asking such a direct question of the secretary. The older man seemed to consider how much to share, then apparently decided that Jim had earned a measure of candor. "Diplomatically, we'll pressure the Soviets through back channels while publicly calling for international condemnation of missile deployments in the Western Hemisphere. Militarily, we'll accelerate our own counter-deployments in Honduras and potentially deploy naval assets to the region." "And Volkov's facility?" Jim pressed. "The missiles and warheads we confirmed?" "Options range from covert action to disable or destroy the facility to more direct military intervention." The Secretary's expression was grave. "The President is committed to preventing these missiles from becoming operational by whatever means necessary." Jim absorbed this information, weighing whether to share the additional insight from his encounter with Volkov. He had included it in his official report, but experience had taught him that such nuanced perspectives sometimes got lost in the intelligence analysis process. "Sir," he began carefully, "based on my conversation with General Volkov, I believe the Soviets anticipated our discovery of the facility. It may even have been part of their strategic calculation, forcing us to respond publicly to a deployment they could otherwise have conducted with greater deniability. The secretary frowned slightly. You believe they wanted us to find the missiles? To what end? To establish a new strategic equilibrium, Jim suggested, recalling Volkov's words. They view these deployments as a counter to our Pershing II missiles in Europe. By ensuring we discovered them, they force official acknowledgement of the new balance without the risk of surprise that could lead to miscalculation. The secretary considered this perspective thoughtfully. Interesting theory. It aligns with some of our analysts' assessments of Soviet strategic thinking under the new Gorbachev regime, more calculated, more focused on forcing diplomatic accommodations rather than direct confrontation. He made a note on his pad, then looked up at Jim with renewed intensity. This General Volkov, you've now encountered him twice in highly sensitive operations. What's your assessment of him as an adversary? Jim chose his words carefully. Professional, intelligent, strategically sophisticated. He thinks several moves ahead and seems to have a deep understanding of American military and political responses. Most concerning, perhaps, is his apparent autonomy. Both in Texas and Nicaragua, he operated with significant independent authority. A dangerous combination, the secretary observed. Intelligence suggests he's become something of a rising star in Soviet military circles, one of the younger generation of officers with increasing influence under Gorbachev. The conversation shifted to Jim's future assignments. With his unique experience facing Soviet operations directly, he was being considered for a specialized role coordinating counter-Soviet activities across multiple theaters. We're creating a new joint task force focused specifically on monitoring and countering Soviet forward deployments of strategic systems, the secretary explained. Your experience with both the SS-21 in Texas and the Nicaraguan facility makes you uniquely qualified to advise this group. It was a significant opportunity, a recognition of Jim's growing expertise in a critical area of Cold War operations. Yet he felt a curious ambivalence about continuing what increasingly seemed like a personal chess match with Volkov across global hotspots. I'll serve wherever I'm needed, sir, Jim responded, the expected answer from a career officer. But I'd like to request that my team from Nicaragua be considered for the task force as well. Their specialized knowledge would be valuable. The secretary nodded in agreement. Already in the works, Captain. This Cold War is becoming increasingly specialized, less about massive armies facing each other across the European plain, and more about small teams of experts engaged in critical operations below the threshold of open conflict. As the meeting concluded, Jim found himself reflecting on the trajectory of his career since that fateful night in Eagle Valley. From a tank commander facing an unexpected threat on American soil to a key player in the shadow war with the Soviet Union, his path had been shaped by encounters with a singular adversary who seemed to understand the game at a level few others grasped. Volkov's words from the Nicaraguan jungle echoed in his mind. We are more alike than different, you and I. Remember that when next we meet. The truth of that observation both disturbed and focused Jim. They were indeed similar, professionals dedicated to their missions, serving larger strategic purposes, committed to excellence in their craft. The difference lay not in their capabilities or character, but in the nations and ideologies they served. As Jim left the Pentagon that afternoon, he knew with certainty that his path would cross with Volkov's again. The Cold War was entering a new phase, one where the confrontation between East and West would be fought not with massive armies, but through precisely targeted operations conducted by specialists on both sides. And in that shadowy realm, two soldiers who might, in another reality, have respected each other as colleagues would instead continue their global chess match, each move potentially altering the strategic balance, each encounter adding another chapter to a story that would likely never appear in any history book. Fort Hood, Texas Veterans Reunion, 2019. The missile deployment in Nicaragua was dismantled through diplomatic channels 3 months later. Colonel James Iron Jim Blackwood explained to his rapt audience. The official story was that the Soviet Union had been planning only conventional missiles, not nuclear-capable ones, and that the withdrawal was a goodwill gesture toward regional stability. The veterans listening to his tale had remained absolutely silent throughout his account of the Nicaraguan mission. Many of them old enough to remember the tensions of the late Cold War period, but unaware of the secret operations that had shaped its course. "And Volkov?" asked one of the older veterans, a former Special Forces operator who clearly understood the significance of such adversarial relationships. Jim smiled slightly, the expression containing complex emotions that only those who had experienced similar encounters could fully comprehend. Our paths crossed many more times before the fall of the Soviet Union, Berlin, Angola, Afghanistan. Each time, the same strange respect mixed with the necessity of opposition. Each time, the awareness that we were playing roles in a larger drama neither of us had written. He reached into his pocket, extracting not the fragment of T-72 armor he had shown earlier, but a different object, a Soviet military medallion bearing the insignia of the Strategic Rocket Forces. He gave me this in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. We met in Berlin, no longer enemies, but not quite friends, representatives of a confrontation that had defined both our lives but suddenly found itself without purpose. The veterans leaned forward, sensing the conclusion of a story that spanned decades and continents, a personal thread through the tapestry of the Cold War. Volkov told me something that day I've never forgotten, Jim continued. He said, "The game is over, my friend, and neither of us has won or lost. We were but pieces moved by larger forces, yet in our small corner of the board, we played with honor." Jim closed his hand around the medallion, feeling its weight, not just the physical heft of the metal, but the history it represented, the strange bond between adversaries who had sought each other's defeat while maintaining a core of professional respect. The greatest victory, Jim concluded, addressing the younger veterans especially, is not destroying your enemy, but understanding him. Not defeating his forces, but comprehending his humanity. Volkov and I were never friends, never allies, but we recognized in each other that essential quality that transcends uniform and flag. The professional soldier's commitment to duty, honor, and the terrible responsibility that comes with the power to wage war. As the gathering eventually broke into smaller conversations, Jim found himself approached by the young captain who had initially challenged his story. "Sir," the young officer said respectfully, "did you ever see Volkov again after Berlin?" Jim smiled enigmatically. "That, Captain, is a story for another time. But I'll tell you this, in the end, we're all soldiers serving something larger than ourselves. The uniforms change, the ideologies shift, but the core remains. Duty, honor, country. Remember that, and you'll never lose your way, even in the darkest valleys." The young captain nodded thoughtfully, seeming to grasp a deeper truth in the older officer's words than mere patriotic platitude. As he walked away, Jim gazed once more at the Soviet medallion in his palm, a reminder of battles fought in shadow, of an adversary who became, in some indefinable way, a counterpart in a deadly global dance. Some stories never reach the history books. Some battles change the world without a single public acknowledgement. And some soldiers fight their most consequential engagements, not with weapons, but with wits, courage, and the unflinching commitment to stand between danger and those they are sworn to protect. For Captain James "Iron Jim" Blackwood, the confrontation with Soviet tanks on American soil had been just the beginning, the opening move in a complex game played across continents and decades. A game where victory was measured not in territory gained, but in catastrophe averted, where success meant not acclaim, but the quiet knowledge of duty fulfilled. And in the end, perhaps that was enough, the soldier's consolation, the warrior's peace.